Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So let's go. Every Christmas Eve, my family has a tradition. We gather at my grandparents' old farmhouse deep in the snowy countryside. This year was no different, except for one thing: the storm. By the time we arrived, snow was coming down in thick sheets, the wind howling like something alive. The farmhouse looked like something out of a postcard with its warm lights glowing through frosted windows, the scent of pine and gingerbread filling the air. The night started out perfect. We laughed, exchanged stories, and sipped hot cocoa while the snow piled up outside. My cousins and I decided to explore the attic, a place that had always fascinated us. It was packed with old trunks, faded decorations, and other forgotten treasures. But that night, it felt different. The air up there was colder, heavier, and the smell of must and something sharper lingered. We found a box labeled Christmas Memories in my grandmother's handwriting. Inside were photos, old ornaments, and a small porcelain figure, a Santa Claus with black eyes. It was no bigger than my hand, and its features were just slightly off, like the smile was too wide and its head tilted just a bit too far to the side. We showed it to my grandmother, expecting her to tell us its story. But when she saw it, her face went pale. She snatched it from my hands and muttered something about it being a family heirloom that should have been left alone. She placed it on the mantel above the fireplace and told us not to touch it again. That was when things started to go wrong. As the night wore on, the storm worsened. The power flickered, then went out entirely, leaving us in the dim glow of candles and the crackling fire. We huddled together in the living room, wrapped in blankets, when we noticed something odd. The Santa figure was gone. At first, we thought my grandmother had moved it, but she insisted she hadn't. My cousins and I searched the room, checking under the furniture and even behind the mantel. Then we heard it. The faint sound of bells, jingling softly, coming from the hallway. We froze. The sound grew louder, closer, and then stopped abruptly. My uncle, thinking it was a prank, walked toward the hallway with his flashlight. We followed hesitantly, the house eerily quiet except for the crunch of snow being blown against the windows. In the hallway, the light of his flashlight caught something. Footprints in the snow. They were small, like a child's, leading from the back door toward the stairs. The door was still locked, bolted from the inside, and no one had come in or out. The prints didn't make sense, and yet there they were, melting slowly in the warmth of the house. The jingling started again, this time from upstairs. It was faint, almost playful, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach churn. We all went silent, exchanging nervous glances. My grandmother whispered, "Don't go up there." But of course, curiosity got the better of us. We climbed the creaking stairs, following the sound of the bells. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time we reached the second floor, our breaths were visible in the flashlight beam. The jingling led us to the attic door, which was ajar. A faint glow spilled out, as if someone had lit a single candle inside. We pushed the door open slowly. The attic was just as we'd left it, but in the center of the room was the Santa figure, sitting upright on an old rocking chair. Its black eyes seemed to glisten in the dim light. Surrounding it were small, wet footprints, circling the chair in chaotic patterns. Then the rocking chair moved. It was subtle at first, just a slight creak as if caught by the wind. But there was no wind in the attic. The chair rocked faster, and the jingling grew louder, more frantic. We stood frozen, too terrified to move, as the figure's grin seemed to stretch wider. The flashlight flickered, plunging the room into darkness. When it came back on, the chair was empty. The figure was gone. We bolted downstairs, hearts pounding, slamming the attic door behind us. The jingling followed us, echoing through the house. My grandmother, pale and trembling, began muttering prayers under her breath. She told us that the Santa figure had been a gift, a curse, passed down through the family. It only came out during Christmas storms and always brought something with it. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the living room, too afraid to move. The storm finally broke around dawn, and with the first light the house felt warmer, safer. We searched every inch of the farmhouse, but the Santa figure was nowhere to be found. I never went back to that farmhouse. My grandmother moved out the following spring, and the house has sat empty ever since. But sometimes, on Christmas Eve, I hear the faint sound of bells outside my window carried on the wind, and I wonder if it's found a new family to haunt. The snow fell softly that Christmas Eve, blanketing the town in a layer of white. The streets were quiet, illuminated by the faint glow of streetlights and the flickering light from homes adorned with twinkling lights and garlands. It was the kind of peaceful night where even the most hardened souls would feel a sense of warmth and comfort. But not for me. Not that night. I was always skeptical about the Christmas spirit. To me, it had always felt forced, like a hollow tradition we all clung to. This year, though, something felt off. My family had moved into a quiet, old house just on the outskirts of town, far from the bustling crowds of the city. The place had been standing for over a century, filled with creaking floors, drafty hallways, and rooms that felt untouched by time. It wasn't until Christmas Eve that things started to feel strange. The house wasn't supposed to be unsettling. It was charming, really. The old fireplace crackled, the scent of pine filled the air, and the faint glow of candles flickered throughout. Yet, despite the festive decor, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. It started with small things. An ornament we hung seemed to sway, even though there was no breeze. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, disappearing when I turned to look. The house creaked more than usual, almost like it was alive, groaning under some unseen weight. Later that night, after my family had gone to bed, I decided to check the house one last time. I moved from room to room, making sure the doors were locked, the windows shut, and the lights turned off. I passed the grand staircase, noticing how the old wooden railing seemed worn and battered, the grain of the wood etched deeply. It was when I was about to descend that I heard it, faint but unmistakable. The sound of soft, deliberate footsteps coming from above. My heart seized. The house was old and sometimes the floorboards creaked on their own. But this was different. The footsteps echoed as if someone was walking slowly, deliberately, down the second-floor hallway. I froze, listening. The footsteps continued, growing closer. But the strange thing was, the sound of them wasn't like a human's. It was slower, heavier, and irregular. The steps didn't follow a natural pattern, as if whatever was making them wasn't quite right, not fully human. I gripped the stair rail and slowly made my way to the top. The house was unnervingly quiet, except for those footsteps. I pushed open the door to the second floor, my breath hitching in my throat. The hallway stretched long, lined with doors, most of them closed. I stepped forward cautiously, my footsteps barely making a sound. The cold air from outside seeped through the thin walls, making my skin crawl. I reached out to touch the nearest doorframe, but then I heard it again, the footsteps, this time directly behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. No one. Panic surged through me as I backed away. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that the house was old and creaky, and these things were just part of its age. But the sensation of being watched, followed, lingered, growing stronger. Then I noticed something odd. The lights from the Christmas tree, which had been glowing brightly in the living room, were flickering faintly. I followed the trail of light and shadows back down the hallway, my breath quickening. When I stepped into the living room, I froze. There, beneath the tree, was a figure. Slouched, motionless, the silhouette nearly blending with the shadows. The figure sat there, gazing up at the tree, its outline faint but unmistakable. I couldn't see any features, just a void where a face should have been. Its posture was unnaturally still, as if it were waiting. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped my flashlight tighter, the beam shaking as it illuminated the figure. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. But the figure didn't move. It simply sat there, watching the tree. Desperately, I turned back toward the door, running, never looking behind me. I bolted down the stairs, my breath ragged, heart racing. The footsteps followed, echoing in my ears. When I got outside, I didn't stop. I ran through the snow, not caring where I went. I didn't stop until I reached the town, my hands trembling, the night air biting at my skin. It was hours later when I returned, unable to forget what I had seen. But when I stepped into that house, everything was normal. The tree was decorated, the fireplace crackled, and my family was fast asleep. The figure, gone, like it had never been there. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. Or maybe, just maybe, something dark still lingers in the old house, watching, waiting. The snow was falling gently that Christmas Eve, blanketing the world in white. It was a rare, peaceful snowfall, covering the small town in a soft, frozen shroud. Everyone was tucked in, waiting for Santa, the warmth of the holiday spirit filling their homes. But not all stories of Christmas are so comforting. I had always loved the quiet, peaceful nights leading up to Christmas. The smell of pine from the tree, the soft glow of the lights, and the faint sound of carolers drifting through the cold air. But this Christmas, something felt different. It started the night before. I'd been helping my family set up the tree, just like we always did. But as we hung the last ornament, there was a sudden, unsettling creak from the attic. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The attic door was slightly ajar. "It's probably just the wind," my dad said, but even he sounded uncertain. Still, we finished decorating and pushed it from our minds. After all, it was Christmas Eve, a night for joy, not fear. But that creaking stayed with me, like a whisper in the back of my head. Later, I found myself unable to sleep. The house was too quiet, too still. Every creak of the floorboards felt louder, each gust of wind through the drafty windows felt colder. I kept hearing faint, hollow footsteps from above, like someone was walking through the attic. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the noise was persistent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next morning, Christmas Day, the house felt different. I went downstairs to find that the tree lights were flickering strangely, casting unsettling shadows across the living room. The cheerful red and green garlands looked almost menacing under the dim glow. Under the tree, there were strange tracks in the snow. They weren't the usual tracks from birds or small animals. They were large, distorted, and seemed to appear from nowhere, leading toward the attic door. I slowly approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The attic door was wide open now, creaking as if something had been moving around up there all night. "Dad?" I called out, but there was no answer. I reached for the attic light and flicked the switch. The bulb flickered once, then died. Darkness poured down the stairs. The footsteps above resumed, more deliberate now, more insistent. It wasn't the wind or some creature outside. Whatever was up there, it was real. Panic started to set in. I didn't know what to do. Should I call for help? But who would believe me on Christmas Day? Everyone was supposed to be safe, happy, and warm. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They sounded like they were coming down the stairs. I backed away, my breath visible in the cold air. The tree lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. But then I heard something else. Whispers. Low, guttural whispers that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me. I couldn't tell if they were voices or something else, something deeper, something ancient. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared from the top of the stairs. It wasn't the warm glow of Christmas lights. It was cold, spectral, like a dim, flickering candle. A figure emerged, obscured by the darkness, its form shifting and distorting. Its eyes were hollow and empty, but they seemed to be watching me, staring right through me. It moved silently, yet with purpose, descending the stairs with a slow, eerie grace. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as it reached the bottom, its whispering filling the space between us. It wasn't Santa Claus, that much was clear. The figure stopped just inches from me. It didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe. It merely stood there, staring, its presence heavier than the darkest night. Then, in an instant, the whispers stopped. The lights flickered back on, casting a cold, hollow glow over the room. And just like that, the figure was gone, vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep again that night. The house remained silent, as if the world itself had gone still, holding its breath. On Christmas morning, my family gathered around the tree, oblivious to the terror that had visited the night before. I didn't tell them what I had seen. How could I? Who would believe me? Even now, I don't know what it was, a spirit or something else entirely. But I know one thing for certain. Something walked through the darkness that Christmas Eve, something that was not supposed to be there. And sometimes on quiet nights I can still hear the faint whispers. It was the week leading up to Christmas, and the town had already descended into a festive haze. Lights strung from house to house, families bustling around with shopping bags, and the sound of carolers echoed through the cold, crisp air. But beneath the jolly surface of the season, something felt off this year. I had always loved Christmas. The warm glow of the fireplace, the sound of wrapping paper being torn apart, and the scent of pine filling the house. But this year was different. It started with the letters. Each morning, I would wake up to find a folded envelope tucked under the front door. No return address, just a crisp, formal handwriting that seemed almost old-fashioned. At first, I assumed it was a harmless holiday card, but when I opened the first one, my blood ran cold. The letter was short, but the message was chilling. You'll never escape the cold of Christmas. I couldn't make sense of it. It wasn't signed, just those words. I dismissed it at first, blaming the late-night stress and the strange winter fatigue I'd been feeling. But every day, the letters kept coming, each one eerier than the last. One afternoon, as I stared out the window, watching the snow fall gently, I noticed something strange. The street was quiet, unusually so. No carolers, no laughter, just a thick, unnatural silence. My phone buzzed, pulling me from the window. Another letter. I opened it, trembling this time. It was a simple drawing. A snow-covered path, lined with tall, shadowy figures that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. Beneath it were more of those words. Follow the path. There's no escaping. My heart pounded as I looked outside again. The shadows seemed deeper now, the snow swirling unnaturally. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the wind howled, rattling the windows like fingers scraping glass. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures from the drawing, standing in the distance, watching. At midnight, a knock at the door jolted me awake. My stomach twisted as I approached the entrance. The air outside was freezing, as if the temperature had dropped far beyond what it should be. The knock came again, sharp, deliberate. Hesitant, I cracked open the door, expecting nothing. But there, standing in the snow, was a figure cloaked in a tattered, old-fashioned coat. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with hollow eyes. Before I could react, they turned and began walking toward the snowy path from the drawing. My feet moved on their own, following them. It was as if something was pulling me forward, guiding me into the night. The path stretched on forever. The snow didn't stop falling, but now it felt heavier, colder. The world felt empty, as if Christmas had been drained of life. The silence was deafening, but I kept walking, unable to stop myself. Suddenly, I heard a voice. Low, almost inaudible but unmistakably there. The cold is always watching. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I turned around, but there was nothing. Just the endless empty trees, their branches heavy with snow. When I looked ahead again, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the path. A figure much closer now. They were tall, faceless, but their presence was overwhelming. The wind whispered through the trees, as if pleading with me to turn back. But I couldn't. The figure began to move, gliding toward me with an unnatural grace. Then, as if breaking the silence, they spoke once more. You'll never escape what you've become. I tried to run, my legs shaking beneath me, but they were faster than anything human. The snow seemed to pull me down, dragging me deeper into the cold. My breath came in short gasps, my vision blurring with exhaustion, and then, in the distance, I saw it. The faint glow of a light. It pulsed softly, almost inviting. Desperate, I moved toward it, the figure still behind me, its footsteps echoing through the snow. When I finally reached the light, I realized it wasn't a salvation. It was a trap. The light wasn't warm or comforting. It was cold, flickering like a dying flame. The figure emerged from the shadows once again, its face now visible, just a void where the eyes should be. Welcome to your eternal winter, lost one. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of whispers carried on the wind. Merry Christmas. Christmas Eve had always been a time of warmth and joy for me. Family gathered around the tree, laughter, the scent of pine filling the air. But that year, something felt different. It wasn't just the usual quiet of the holiday season. It was as if the world had grown eerily still. We lived in a small town, surrounded by dense forests that stretched far beyond what anyone cared to explore. The snow-covered trees stood silent, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots in the snow and the faint crackling of the fire in the living room. The town had a charm to it, sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. It started late in the evening, after the gifts had been opened and we were all settled around the fireplace. My parents were dozing off, and I sat in the dim light, staring at the flickering flames. That's when I first noticed it. The soft sound of footsteps in the snow outside. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe it was a neighbor taking a walk, someone out for a late-night stroll. But the footsteps were rhythmic, deliberate, almost like they were following a pattern. I leaned closer to the window, peering through the frost, but all I could see was the dark outline of the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then, a soft knocking at the door. My heart skipped. It was just past midnight and no one should have been outside. I moved cautiously toward the door, hoping it was just someone from the town, maybe someone who had gotten lost in the snow. But when I opened it, there was no one there. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin, and looked around. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there at all. I checked the porch, shining my flashlight into the yard, but the only thing that greeted me was the endless expanse of snow-covered trees. As I stood there, puzzled, I heard the whispering again. Soft, indistinct voices carried by the wind. The air seemed heavier, as if the very night was holding its breath. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. That wasn't the last time I heard those footsteps. The next day, Christmas Day, was when it all became worse. The house felt off. The usual warmth was gone. The fire crackled less and shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. The laughter of my family felt distant, as if they were underwater. I tried to push away the thought that we weren't alone. But then, that evening, the knocking returned. Soft and measured, persistent. I couldn't ignore it this time. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the door, trembling. The snow was deeper now, the ground untouched by anyone since the night before. I couldn't see any footprints leading up to the house. As I opened the door, I saw him, the figure standing in the snow. His face was obscured by a ragged hood, and in his hand he clutched a sack. There was something unnaturally cold about him, something that made my breath catch. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. The sack in his hand moved slightly, like something was shifting inside it. I tried to look away, but his gaze seemed to pull me in, colder than the winter air around us. The whispering started again, soft and rhythmic. It wasn't words I could understand, but they seemed to echo in my mind. "Listen," they seemed to say, though no one spoke out loud. I shut the door, my hand trembling on the lock. I backed away from it, the knocking fading into silence. But I knew he was still there, watching from the other side. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the whispers, the soft, rhythmic sounds that seemed to echo through the house. I stared at the Christmas tree, its ornaments glowing dimly in the dark, when I noticed something odd. One of the ornaments was swinging, even though there was no breeze. I got up, my heart racing, and traced the motion. The figure, the one from outside, was standing just a few feet from me, its gaze fixed on the tree. His hollow eyes seemed to stare right through me, as though he was waiting for something. Then, in a voice that wasn't human, he spoke. "Why do you celebrate? Do you know the truth about this night?" I couldn't answer. My throat was dry and my mind was racing. What did he mean? Before I could even process what was happening, he vanished, leaving behind only silence and the faint echo of his whispers. Christmas Day ended in a cold haze, the shadow of that figure lingering in my thoughts. I haven't seen him since, but I can still hear the whispers on quiet nights, especially around Christmas. Maybe he was just a part of some dream, some nightmare brought on by too much solitude and cold. Or maybe, I still wonder, he was something else entirely, something that never left. Every year, my family made it a tradition to spend Christmas Eve at my grandparents' old farmhouse. It was a place steeped in holiday nostalgia, with creaky wooden floors, dusty ornaments, and the scent of pine filling the air. But there was always something unsettling about that house, something none of us could quite put our finger on. It wasn't just the creaks and groans of an old building settling in the night. There was a feeling, something intangible, like a shadow lingering just out of sight. Every Christmas we'd try to ignore it, tell ourselves it was the old farmhouse's charm, but deep down, we all knew better. That year, things felt different from the start. The snow had fallen heavily, blanketing the countryside in thick, untouched white. As we pulled up to the house, the glow of the porch lights flickered in the gathering dusk, casting long shadows over the yard. My grandparents were always so festive, always with their tree glowing brightly in the corner and the sound of Christmas carols humming from the old record player. After settling in and exchanging gifts, we all gathered in the living room, surrounded by the warmth of the fire. My cousin, Laura, made a comment about hearing strange noises from upstairs. It wasn't unusual. Old houses creaked and settled after all, but there was something off about the sound. It wasn't just creaking floors or wind in the chimney. It was deliberate. "It's probably just the house settling," my uncle said, laughing, though I could tell his tone was forced. As the night deepened, my aunt volunteered to fetch more logs for the fire, disappearing into the cold, dark hallway. The rest of us stayed by the fire, the sounds of Christmas fading into a quiet lull. After what felt like an eternity, my aunt returned, her face pale and eyes wide. "Something's not right," she whispered, sitting down beside us. "What do you mean?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. "The door to the attic was open," she said. "And it wasn't like that when I left. I know I shut it." We all exchanged uneasy glances. None of us had gone near the attic. The door to that old space had been locked for as long as I could remember. No one dared go up there. My grandfather, a proud, stoic man, stood from his chair, his expression hardening. "I'll check it out," he said, his tone firm. The rest of us followed him despite our better judgment. The staircase to the attic creaked under his weight as he ascended. The rest of us stood at the bottom, listening to the slow, measured steps echoing above. "Anything up there?" my uncle called, after what felt like an eternity. "No," came my grandfather's reply. "Nothing but dust and old boxes." But the uncertainty remained in his voice, and his quick descent back down the stairs did little to comfort us. As he reached the bottom, he looked pale and troubled. "Something felt off," he muttered, shaking his head. We tried to brush it off, though the tension in the room was palpable. As the evening went on, we went back to the living room, trying to carry on as usual. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something wasn't done with us. It wasn't until we heard the soft jingle of bells that we all froze. The sound was faint, far away, almost too quiet to hear. But there it was, like the faint echo of a distant sleigh. It grew louder, approaching from the attic stairs. "Maybe it's just the wind," my father said, his voice shaky. But there was no wind, and now we all heard the distinct sound of something heavy, trudging down the stairs. My grandfather stood again, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice shaking. "I'll check." Slowly, he made his way to the foot of the staircase. The rest of us clung to each other, our eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. The bells had stopped, and now we heard nothing but silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. After what felt like an eternity, my grandfather returned, his face ghostly. "There's nothing there," he said, but his voice was barely audible. We didn't stay much longer. We packed our things in haste, feeling the cold creeping in from outside. The farmhouse felt alive in a way it never had before. Watching. Waiting. The next morning, we searched the house thoroughly, but there was no sign of anything unusual, no traces of the strange events we had witnessed. The attic door remained locked, just as it had been for decades. To this day, none of us speak of that Christmas night. The farmhouse is still in the family, but it feels different now, colder, more distant. Every year, as we gather around the fire, there's an unspoken fear that something lingers there, watching from the shadows of Christmas past. The snowfall that Christmas Eve was unlike anything anyone could remember. The quiet little town was blanketed in white, the streets deserted, save for the gentle crunch of snow beneath my boots. I had always loved Christmas, decorating the tree, exchanging gifts, the warmth of the fire. But this year, something felt off. It began earlier that day when I received the first card. It wasn't a typical Christmas card. There was no signature, no heartfelt message inside, just a single photo of my living room. I stared at it, confusion turning to unease. How had someone gotten inside my house? I didn't remember leaving the door unlocked. Thinking it must be a prank, I shook it off and continued with my evening. But when I checked the front door, it was locked. No sign of forced entry. It made no sense. Hours later, another card appeared. This one, even stranger, inside was a photo of my Christmas tree, ornaments glistening, yet distorted in some unnatural way. The tree seemed too tall, too crooked, as though it had grown wrong. There was no return address, no hint of who had sent them. I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. Every shadow seemed to whisper. Each creak of the old wooden floorboards echoed louder in my mind than they should have. As midnight approached, I heard a soft knock at the door. My heart jumped, but I refused to answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Then silence. I peeked through the curtain, but saw no one. Determined to make it through the night, I lit a few candles, hoping the flickering flames would offer some comfort. The house felt colder now, as though the warmth had been drained from the air. I could still hear faint whispers, almost like the sound of children giggling. Too faint to be real, too clear to ignore. Then, just as I turned to face the living room, I saw it. The shadow of a figure standing in front of the window, barely visible in the dim candlelight. It wasn't human. Its face was obscured, the features contorted into something unrecognizable, unnatural. I froze, unable to move, unable to look away. The figure remained there for what felt like an eternity, unmoving, as though studying me, waiting for something. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, the sound of voices echoing in my ears. They weren't speaking words, but the noise was more unsettling than any language I'd ever heard. It felt as though something was calling to me, from the shadows, from beyond. The candles flickered violently, the room plunging into darkness. I tried to light them again, but they wouldn't stay. The cold air became unbearable, creeping into my bones. Then the knock came once more, louder than before. But this time, it wasn't just at the door. It was coming from inside the house, from behind me. I turned around, heart racing, and saw the figure standing in the doorway. Its eyes glowed faintly, hollow and empty, like dark holes where nothing lived. Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just tilted its head, the distorted grin spreading wider. I stumbled backward, my vision blurring until I collided with something cold and hard. I glanced down. It was the figure's shadow, stretching across the floor. But it wasn't just a shadow. It was alive. It slithered toward me, dragging itself slowly, unnaturally. A voice echoed in my mind. "He sees you. He sees all." Panic took hold, but I didn't run. My feet felt rooted to the floor. I could feel the icy breath of the figure on my neck as it whispered, "You invited him in." A chill ran down my spine as I realized what the figure meant. The cards, the photos. I hadn't invited anyone, but someone had invited me. The figure's grin widened as it leaned closer. Its breath was icy, unnatural. Then, just before everything went black, it spoke. "You'll never be alone again." When I woke, the house was silent. The door was still locked, but the snow had stopped falling. The Christmas lights still flickered faintly outside. But I knew I wasn't alone. The figure had taken something with it. Something I could feel lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. It was Christmas Eve when it happened. The snow had been falling since late afternoon, covering the small village in a blanket of white. The village was peaceful, almost too quiet, with only the distant sound of jingling bells from a horse-drawn sleigh echoing through the streets. I had always loved Christmas, the warmth of the fire, the flickering lights, and the sound of laughter. But this year, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I decided to take a walk through the village, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The streets were deserted, the only sound being my footsteps crunching against the snow. The occasional street lamp flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the empty cobblestone roads. As I turned the corner near the old church, I saw it. A figure standing by the bell tower, staring at me with hollow, lifeless eyes. It was a man, or at least it used to be. His features were gaunt, pale, and distorted, like something from a dream, or a nightmare. I stopped in my tracks, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, motionless, as if waiting. Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just silence, save for the faint jingling of bells in the distance. As I backed away slowly, the figure raised a hand, as though beckoning me closer. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached my home, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. The next morning, the village was covered in snow, the streets peaceful once more. But the figure was gone, disappeared like a wisp of smoke in the cold morning air. I told myself it had to be some trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But the memory of those hollow eyes still haunts me every Christmas. Whatever was out there that night, it's still waiting, watching. And I can't shake the feeling that it'll return one year when I least expect it. It was a few days before Christmas, and the town was covered in a thick layer of snow. The streets were quiet, mostly deserted, except for the soft crunch of boots on snow. We had just returned from the holiday rush at the local Christmas market, where the air was filled with the scent of pine and roasted chestnuts. The house had always felt different during the holidays. Old, like something from another time. My family had lived there for as long as I could remember, but tonight, something felt off. The holiday decorations didn't bring the usual warmth. Instead, the flickering lights cast unsettling shadows across the wooden floors and old, faded wallpaper. We put on Christmas carols, hoping to lighten the mood. But as the music played, something about the house seemed to resist it, like it didn't want to celebrate. That's when I noticed the figure standing in the corner of the living room. At first, I thought it was one of my family members, but when I turned, there was no one there. It was just a tall, thin shadow, barely visible in the dim light of the tree. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then, a soft, distant whisper filled the room. A voice, low and hollow, as if it were coming from inside the walls. I hurried to turn off the music, but as soon as I did, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from outside or inside. It felt as though the house itself was speaking. The air felt colder, despite the fire roaring in the fireplace. My heart pounded as I crept toward the figure in the corner. The closer I got, the clearer I could see it. A tall, faceless figure draped in tattered clothes, its limbs moving in unnatural jerks. Its eyes were hollow, black as coal. Who are you?" I whispered, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it lifted one bony hand and pointed to the Christmas tree. That's when I saw it. The ornaments on the tree were shimmering, not with the usual festive glow, but with a faint, eerie light. The edges of the room seemed to blur, as though the very air had been twisted by whatever was here. Then, just like that, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. The whispering intensified, and I could feel the cold creeping in, seeping into my bones. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It felt like something was pressing down on my chest. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. The house was silent once again, but I knew it wasn't empty. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers still echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something that had never been part of our world, or our Christmas. It was Christmas Eve, and the town was blanketed in a layer of untouched snow. The lights from the old Victorian houses gleamed faintly through the frost-covered windows, creating a peaceful, festive scene. My family had just moved into one of those houses a few months ago, a big, creaky place with more history than we could have imagined. From the moment we arrived, there had been strange things happening. Nothing major, just the occasional creak of the floorboards when no one was walking, doors opening by themselves, and the feeling of being watched when I was home alone. We chalked it up to the house settling, the cold, or maybe our own nerves from being in such an old place. But tonight, as the clock struck midnight, everything changed. The house had always felt a little off at night, especially around Christmas. I figured it was just the echoes of our imaginations, but tonight was different. The air felt thick, like something was lingering. It began with a faint jingling sound, distant at first, but it grew louder and more distinct. I followed the sound, my curiosity outweighing my growing unease. As I made my way down the hallway, I realized the noise wasn't coming from outside. It was from inside the house itself. The closer I got, the clearer it became. Bells, tiny ones, like those from a reindeer harness. The sound led me to the staircase, but when I reached the top, there was nothing, just silence. I stood there for a moment, staring down the dark, carpeted stairs. The jingling had stopped, but I could still feel something, someone, watching from the shadows. Suddenly, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't the faint jingle of bells. It was a soft, whispering voice, almost like it was right behind me. "Are you ready for Christmas?" I froze. My breath caught in my throat. There was no one there, no sign of anyone at all. I slowly turned around, but the hallway stretched behind me, silent and empty. The whispering started again, louder this time, as if it was moving closer. "Are you ready for Christmas?" It echoed through the empty house as though the walls themselves were asking. Panic set in. I wanted to run, but something made me stay. I couldn't move. The soft jingling began again, this time louder and faster. I followed the sound, my heart pounding as I descended the stairs. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Suddenly, at the base of the staircase, I saw them. A figure stood by the old Christmas tree in the corner of the room. It was small, too small, and cloaked in tattered robes. The thing's head hung low, the eyes hidden beneath a wide, ragged hood, but I could still feel its gaze on me, cold and empty. It held out tiny hands, tiny bells tied to its wrists jingling as it moved toward me. "Are you ready for Christmas?" it whispered again, its voice trembling with an unnatural urgency. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no reasoning with whatever it was. Fear consumed me as I tried to run, but I couldn't escape the sound. The relentless jingling of its bells, the whispers growing louder. As I turned to flee, I heard a new noise from upstairs. Louder, sharper. Footsteps. Heavy ones dragging slowly across the floorboards. "Are you ready for Christmas?" came the whisper, now mixed with a childlike giggle. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt frozen, my body trembling. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure and the sound of the bells vanished. The house fell silent, the whispers fading into the still night. I stood there, motionless, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When dawn broke, the house felt normal again, just like any other day. But to this day, I hear those bells, especially around Christmas. The whispers seem to linger in the corners of my mind, reminding me of a night I'll never forget. I'll never forget the night it happened. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect anything strange, just an ordinary apartment complex on the outskirts of town. My roommate, Anna, and I had lived there for about a year, always keeping to ourselves, never believing in anything supernatural. That night, I stayed up late scrolling through my phone while Anna had already gone to bed. The building was quiet, except for the faint sound of creaking floors as people moved around in neighboring apartments. I didn't think much of it until I heard something coming from inside my closet. At first, I assumed it was just the usual settling of the building, old pipes, settling walls, creaking floorboards. But the sound didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like someone shifting inside the closet, dragging something along the floor. I set my phone down and sat up, listening. The sound was coming from the back of the closet, from deep within. My pulse quickened as I imagined what could be inside. I stood up, my feet making soft thuds on the worn carpet, and walked toward the closet. The door creaked open as I pulled it back. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't what I saw. Nothing but old clothes and random boxes stacked in the corner. I sighed, relieved but still uneasy, and pulled the closet door shut again. As I turned to head back to bed, something caught my eye. A faint shadow flickering at the edge of the doorframe. I froze, staring at it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But the shadow lingered, unmoving. I wanted to dismiss it, but something wasn't right. Slowly, I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. I reached out and touched the doorframe, but there was nothing there. Then, from inside the apartment came a whisper. It was faint at first, so soft I almost convinced myself it was in my head. "Let me out." I spun around, my breath catching. The whisper had come from the direction of the closet, but there was no one there. My hands trembled as I forced myself to look back at the closet door. It was still shut, but I could feel the presence of whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Let me out." I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My legs moved involuntarily toward the closet. I wasn't in control anymore, as if something had taken over my body. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to process what I was hearing. Then, with a burst of courage I didn't know I had, I threw open the closet door. Nothing, just empty clothes and old boxes. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared into the abyss of the dark closet. But it wasn't empty. I could feel it, like someone, or something, was watching me from within. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off the closet. The whisper was still there, though it had softened like it was retreating but not quite gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every shuffle of a neighbor in the hall, felt like it was pointing right to me. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to look inside the closet again. I told Anna what happened, but she didn't believe me. Still, that night, and every night after, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whisper, "Let me out." It was a late summer evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old lighthouse on the edge of the coast. We had heard the stories about the place. The locals always mentioned strange things happening out there, but none of us believed in the so-called haunted lighthouse tales. We were just looking for an adventurous night, something to break the monotony of our usual weekends. The lighthouse stood on a narrow stretch of rocky coastline, rising above the crashing waves. The air was thick with salt, and the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly, the sun dipping into the dark sea. We parked the car a few hundred feet from the lighthouse and started walking the narrow gravel path that led up to it. The wind was fierce, tearing at our jackets, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below echoed like a low, persistent hum. It was eerie, but we all just laughed it off, attributing it to the remoteness of the place. When we reached the base of the lighthouse, the first thing I noticed was how worn down it looked. The old white paint was peeling, revealing patches of weathered stone beneath. It felt abandoned, yet oddly familiar. We climbed the spiral staircase inside, the sound of our footsteps clattering against the cold metal steps. At the top, the view was stunning. The sun had fully set by now, leaving the sky a deep shade of purple, the stars beginning to emerge. We stood there, leaning against the railing, mesmerized by the vastness of the ocean stretching out before us. But that's when I noticed something unusual. It wasn't just the beauty of the view, it was the silence. No seagulls, no distant boats, no wind. It was as though the world had stopped. "Did anyone else hear that?" I asked, breaking the quiet. They all turned, confused. "Hear what?" someone replied. "I don't know. It's too quiet. It's unnatural." As the minutes dragged on, we stood there staring out at the horizon. The air felt heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing on the edge of the cliff. My breath hitched. "Is that someone out there?" I whispered, pointing. None of them saw it. The figure was silhouetted against the dark sea, motionless, as if waiting. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but it didn't move. And then, just as suddenly as I'd seen it, the figure was gone. I glanced at my friends, but they were still oblivious, staring out at the sea. "Maybe it's just my eyes playing tricks," I said, trying to brush it off. But my heart still pounded, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We made our way down from the lighthouse, the night feeling heavier than before. The walk back to the car was silent. None of us spoke much. the weight of whatever we had seen still lingering in the air. It wasn't until we got back to town and were sitting in the diner, hours later, that things took an even stranger turn. One of my friends, Mark, suddenly leaned forward, his face pale. "Did anyone else feel like we weren't the only ones up there?" His voice was low, almost trembling. We all looked at him, nodding slowly. Every single one of us had the same feeling. That figure we'd seen wasn't something imagined. That figure. What if it wasn't human? I asked quietly, the unease washing over me again. The room grew silent. That's when it hit me. The stories we had dismissed earlier about the lighthouse being haunted came rushing back. What if they were true? What if whatever that figure was had been watching us all night? We never went back to that lighthouse, and even now, I wonder if something still watches from the cliffs at night, waiting for the next visitors to stumble upon its lonely, desolate shores. It started as an ordinary trip to the local library. My sister and I were always close, and we spent countless afternoons browsing through rows of old, dusty books. That day, the library felt emptier than usual. The shelves towered over us, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor as we walked. We had made our way to the back of the library, past the quiet study rooms and the dimly lit reading areas. The air smelled like old paper and dust. As we wandered further into the maze of bookshelves, I noticed how still everything was. No whispers, no children running, just silence. Even my sister seemed more subdued than usual. "I'll meet you over there," she said, gesturing toward a section I wasn't particularly interested in. I watched her disappear behind a row of shelves, lost in a world of her own. I kept browsing, pulling a book off the shelf and flipping through the pages. Something about the stillness was unsettling. The library wasn't big, but today it felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only ones there. I moved toward the back, deeper into the old section of the library where the shelves creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the row, something caught my eye. A table nestled in the corner, covered with old, dusty books. One of them wasn't like the others. The cover was worn, pages yellowed and brittle, but there was something different. Curious, I picked it up and dusted it off. The title was barely legible, faded with time. Whispers from the Void. My stomach sank. I opened the book, but the pages were blank, completely blank. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down. As I flipped through the pages, a whisper escaped from the shadows behind me. I froze. The sound was faint. Just a whisper, but it wasn't from anyone I could see. The air shifted around me and I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall shelves stretching into the dim corners of the library. My heart thudded against my chest and I knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the silent aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the low, endless whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I clutched the book tightly and began to back away. I had to find my sister. I needed to get out of there. The whispering followed me, trailing like a shadow. I moved as quickly as I could, my breath hitching with every step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard my sister's voice from further down the hall. "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Her voice sounded distant, echoing strangely. "I'm here," I yelled, but it felt hollow, as though my voice wasn't reaching her. "Where are you?" No response. The whispers grew louder, drowning out any trace of my sister's voice. I turned the corner, hoping to find her, but the library seemed to twist and stretch before my eyes. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, stretching far beyond what I remembered. "Please, just tell me where you are," I shouted, my voice breaking. Silence. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but something was wrong. Her figure wasn't quite right. Her back was arched unnaturally, and she wasn't moving like she usually did. It was as if she were floating. "Please come back," I cried, my legs trembling as I rushed toward her. But as I drew closer, I noticed her face. It wasn't my sister's. The eyes that stared back at me were hollow, empty, devoid of anything human. A sinister grin stretched across her lips. "No," I whispered, backing away. The whispers filled the air once more, louder now, like a chorus of unseen voices. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each shadow deeper and darker than before. I turned to run, but the endless corridors shifted, moving as if the library itself was alive. I couldn't escape. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm, serene, yet undeniably chilling. "You're not supposed to leave." I closed my eyes, clutching the book to my chest. When I opened them again, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped. The library was still, eerily quiet. But when I turned around, my sister was gone. And so was the book. I don't remember how I ended up on the hiking trail that day. I'd never been much of an outdoors person, but something about the open air and quiet drew me there. My plan had been simple: spend the afternoon walking along a familiar trail, clear my head, and get away from everything for a while. It wasn't a popular trail, tucked deep into the mountains where few people dared to venture. I'd come across it a few times before, but never explored it fully. The sun was high, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The air was crisp, the kind of silence that wraps around you and feels endless. I walked for hours, following the winding trail deeper into the woods, never thinking twice about turning back. It felt peaceful. Too peaceful. The absence of birds, the quiet rustling of leaves. The trail was so isolated I almost expected to hear nothing at all. But still, something nagged at the back of my mind. It was as if the woods themselves were watching. Eventually, I found myself standing at a fork in the path. One side led to a steep incline, the other seemed to stretch on toward the valley below. Without hesitation, I chose the incline, curious about where it might lead. It wasn't until I'd climbed what felt like hours that I realized I was well beyond any familiar landmarks. I told myself to turn back, but something kept me going. The air became colder as I ascended, the trees growing denser. The trail became narrower, and I started to notice strange markings on the bark of the trees. Scratches, like someone had carved symbols into the wood. I brushed them off as some random hiker's curiosity, but there was a pattern, one I couldn't quite place. The farther I went, the quieter it became, until even my own footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally. That's when I heard it. A faint, hollow whisper, like the wind carrying someone else's voice. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no wind, no breeze. The air was still. "Help me," the voice said, barely audible. It was distant, but clear. I stood there, my skin crawling as I listened. My heart raced, but I couldn't move. "Help me," the voice repeated, louder this time. It wasn't coming from any particular direction. It was all around me. Panic surged through my chest and I turned to run, only to trip over something in the undergrowth. My flashlight bounced away, leaving me in darkness. The woods felt alive, shifting around me as though they were watching, waiting. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed my phone, only to find there was no signal. The darkness felt heavier now, oppressive, like the trees were closing in. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to steady myself. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Just silence, except for that whisper growing closer now, louder, echoing in my ears. "Help me." I turned, panic turning my vision blurry as I saw a figure, tall, gaunt, and pale, standing at the edge of the trail. Its features were obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its hollow gaze fixated on me. I backed away, my hands shaking, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was begging. I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run before, dodging branches and tripping over rocks. The whisper followed me, always just a step behind. The path seemed endless, the trees shifting and bending as if to block my way. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled into an open clearing. The sky above me was dark, stars faintly visible through a break in the trees. My chest heaved as I collapsed to the ground, trembling. The whisper had stopped, but I knew it wasn't over. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The woods were still, too still. I wanted to stay there, but I couldn't. I forced myself to my feet and followed the path I had come from. I kept walking until I saw the faint outline of the trailhead. As I stepped out into the open, the first light of dawn touched the horizon. I could still feel it, though. The heavy weight of the woods, like something was watching, waiting, still following me. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. I've always been a creature of habit. Every Friday night, I'd grab my camera and head to the old train tracks that cut through the woods. It wasn't a destination anyone talked about. It was just a place, quiet and desolate, where I could sit and lose myself in the sounds of the passing trains. That night was no different. I parked my car at the edge of the tracks and made my way through the dense underbrush. The woods stretched on forever, the trees towering above, blocking out any sign of the outside world. I loved the solitude, the way everything seemed to pause out here. No phone signal, no noise, no interruptions, just me and the sound of the tracks stretching into the distance. I set my tripod up, adjusting the camera to capture the faint glow of the distant train lights. As I waited, I realized how dark it had become. The forest had swallowed all light, leaving only the cold glow of the moon casting shadows over the tracks. A slight breeze rustled the leaves, and the distant hum of a train echoed faintly in the distance. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees, a shape, slender and dark, blending into the shadows. I thought maybe it was an animal, but there was something unnatural about the way it moved. Smooth, almost fluid, yet completely wrong. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it wasn't natural. The figure stepped closer, moving with that same eerie grace, never making a sound. I froze, my finger hovering over the camera. My heart pounded, every nerve on edge. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. As it drew nearer, I could make out more details. It wasn't fully human. The proportions were off. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that no person could. But the most disturbing thing was its face. No eyes, no nose, just a blank, hollow void where a face should have been. I wanted to look away, to grab my camera and run, but something held me there, frozen in place. The figure stood just a few feet from me now, its inky, featureless face staring straight ahead. I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. That's when I realized it wasn't looking at me. It was looking through me. Panic surged through me, but my legs refused to move. It tilted its head as if examining me. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the trees. The silence returned, broken only by the distant rumble of a train far off in the distance. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling as I reached for my camera. The lens trembled as I brought it up, but there was nothing to capture. No figure, no tracks, just the woods. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to process what I had seen. The train came, its light sweeping through the trees, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I waited, and when it passed, I grabbed my tripod and camera, my mind spinning, unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching me. That something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I never went back. I'll never forget that day. It started out ordinary enough. My friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the nearby lake. We weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary. Just a few hours of peace, some fishing, and maybe a swim if we felt like it. Nothing seemed unusual as we packed up and drove down the winding dirt road leading to the lake. We'd been going to this spot for years. It was remote, surrounded by trees and hills, with no cell service and few visitors. The kind of place where you could truly get away from everything. When we arrived, the sun was high in the sky, and the lake shimmered under its light. We set up a small camp by the shore, blankets, coolers filled with drinks, and a fishing line tossed into the water. It was the kind of day where you lose track of time, relaxing in the warm sun. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The first sign came when we noticed the birds went quiet. The chirping had gradually died down, but we didn't think much of it. It wasn't until we glanced up at the sky that something truly strange happened. The clouds seemed to darken, even though the sun was still shining brightly. It was as if the world had turned gray for a moment, without warning. I looked around, feeling a knot of discomfort form in my stomach. My friends were laughing, oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wandered a bit away from the camp, standing at the edge of the water, staring out into the lake. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing at the far side of the lake. It wasn't moving, just standing there as though it were staring directly at me. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light or someone from a distant campsite. But no one ever came to this part of the lake. The figure was still too far away for me to make out any details, but the sensation of being watched deepened. I called out to my friends, trying to shake off the unease. They didn't hear me. Or if they did, they didn't seem concerned. I didn't want to ruin the day with my paranoia, so I pushed the feeling aside. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were sitting around the campfire, that things got worse. The air had grown colder, the sun long set, leaving us with only the dim glow of the fire. The quiet was now oppressive, a stillness that felt unnatural. It wasn't like the calm of nature, it was like something had swallowed the sounds of the night. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. We talked, but the conversation felt forced, the laughter awkward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every time I looked around, I saw nothing but trees and darkness. Then, from out of nowhere, we heard it. Soft, distorted whispers. They weren't coming from any direction. It was as if they surrounded us, echoing in the stillness. I strained to make out the words, but whatever was being said was too faint, too unnatural. I couldn't bring myself to ignore it anymore. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. They shook their heads, looking at me like I was imagining things. But then I saw it again, the figure, much closer now. It was standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. It was too dark to make out any features, only the faint silhouette, almost human, but not quite. The whispering intensified, as if the figure was breathing the sound into the air. Panic set in. I felt the cold rush through my veins, and my body trembled uncontrollably. I tried to call out again, but no words would come. The figure moved a step closer. It wasn't walking. It glided, as if pulled by some unseen force. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I felt my friends tugging at my arm, pulling me toward the campfire, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It felt like whatever this thing was, it had me trapped. My friends didn't see it, didn't hear the whispers. They told me to snap out of it, convinced I was just spooked by the isolation. But then something happened that I'll never forget. The figure, which had been standing still for what felt like forever, suddenly turned and disappeared into the trees. One moment it was there, and the next, gone, like it had never existed. I tried to explain to my friends what I saw, what I felt, but they couldn't see it. The whispers returned for a brief moment, distant and faint. And then, just like before, silence. I've never been able to return to that lake. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what it wanted. All I know is that something was there, something that wasn't human, and no one else ever saw it. It was a quiet, ordinary Friday night. I worked at a small local museum, one of those places with dim lighting and long hallways filled with ancient artifacts. The building had a certain charm to it, but by night it felt hollow, lifeless, like the stories of the past were fading into silence. My shift was from midnight to 8 a.m., and most nights were uneventful, just me and the quiet hum of security cameras. That night, everything was routine as usual. I walked through the galleries, checking the displays, making sure everything was locked up tight. The only sounds were the creak of my footsteps and the faint echo of the security system beeping softly. Around 2 a.m., I was in the main hall near the old exhibit on ancient civilizations. The air felt heavy, like it had been pulled from somewhere deep beneath the earth. The lights flickered once, briefly, and then returned to their usual dull glow. I shrugged it off, assuming it was the building settling. I glanced at the case with the ancient pottery, its intricate designs worn from years of dust and time. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the display cases was cracked open, my stomach twisted. These cases were made to be impossible to open without the alarm system triggering. The glass wasn't shattered, it was simply opened. Carefully. I approached, my breath quickening. The artifact inside, the ancient stone mask, was gone. In its place was nothing but empty air. I called security immediately, my voice shaky. The line crackled, but no one answered. I wandered through the museum, heart pounding as I checked each exhibit. One by one, I realized others had been tampered with. A display of ancient scrolls was wide open, the texts scattered on the floor. A case housing old coins was now empty. The more I walked, the more I noticed. Every artifact was either disturbed or missing. Panic set in. What was happening? Someone had broken in, but there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of where they'd gone. I turned a corner and froze. The security camera feed on the wall was glitching, the screen flickering wildly. I stared at the screen, my breath catching. The camera wasn't showing the empty hallways it should have been. Instead, I could see something else. In the grainy, distorted feed, I saw figures, tall, shadowy figures walking through the museum. They moved silently like they were gliding rather than walking. Their faces were obscured, but I knew instinctively they were not human. One of them stopped in front of the empty display case where the ancient mask had been. The figure tilted its head as if inspecting the empty space. Then it turned slowly, as though it could feel my gaze, and began walking toward the camera. The screen went black. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. There was no one to call, no one who could help me. I could feel them in the museum, moving through the darkened halls like ghosts. As I stood frozen, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed, I noticed something else. The air was colder now, colder than it had any right to be, considering the time of year. The faint sound of whispers filled the stillness, voices murmuring in languages I couldn't understand. I wanted to run, but every instinct told me that running wouldn't help. They were already here. I kept walking, trying to find an escape, but everywhere I went, the shadows followed. I realized, too late, that the missing artifacts weren't random. They were gone. Stolen by the figures that had emerged from some forgotten part of the museum. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't from the shadows or from the air. It was behind me, right beside me. Return what was taken. I turned around, but there was nothing there. No one. No sound, except for the whispers, still echoing from the darkness. I didn't know if I was losing my mind, but I knew I couldn't stay. I rushed out of the museum, sprinting into the night, my breath visible in the cold air. The police came later, of course. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone breaking in. The artifacts were never recovered, and the museum remained silent. They assumed someone had broken in and escaped, but I knew the truth. Whatever those things were, whatever had taken the artifacts, they were still there, waiting. I've never gone back to that museum, and I never will. I've always loved the quiet of the night. There's something about the stillness that feels peaceful, calming. A few months ago, I took a spontaneous trip to an old abandoned lighthouse perched on the edge of the coast. It wasn't a typical tourist spot, more of a forgotten relic. The lighthouse had been decommissioned years ago, left to crumble under the weight of time and the sea breeze. My friends had backed out, calling the idea too weird, but I was drawn to the solitude. I set out around sunset, carrying only a flashlight and a small backpack with a few essentials. The hike to the lighthouse was long, winding along cliffs that dropped off into the endless ocean below. As I climbed higher, the world seemed to shrink, the noises of civilization fading away. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a trail of pink and orange across the sky. By the time I reached the lighthouse, night had fully taken hold. The structure was towering and silent, its paint chipped and its windows broken. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. It felt like stepping back in time, a place that had been abandoned long before I'd arrived. Inside the lighthouse was just as I imagined, cold and damp, with old wooden beams groaning under the weight of neglect. The air was thick with the smell of mildew. I climbed up the narrow spiral staircase to the top, each creak of the old wooden steps echoing in the empty tower. At the top, the view was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out in every direction, the moonlight casting a silver sheen over the waves. I settled in on the edge of the platform, staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. The silence was almost deafening. There was no wind, no crashing waves, just stillness. I was about to close my eyes when I heard it, a faint, distant cry. It was soft, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, but not quite. I froze. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. Another cry followed, closer this time. My heart started to race. It wasn't human, not exactly, but it felt close. The sound was strange, almost like a mix of a scream and a moan, drifting up from the base of the lighthouse. I climbed down the stairs slowly, every creak echoing louder than before. I kept my flashlight aimed down, scanning the shadows as I went. The sound seemed to be coming from below, beneath the lighthouse. It wasn't an animal, not the wind. It was something else entirely. When I reached the bottom, the cries had stopped. The air felt colder, more oppressive. I walked around the structure, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The silence returned, almost suffocating. That's when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. Movement. A figure stood just at the edge of the cliff, barely visible in the dark. I squinted, but they didn't move. They were watching, unmoving, just standing there. My breath hitched as I pointed the flashlight toward them. For a moment, I thought it was a person, but there was something off. The figure wasn't human. The light only illuminated their outline, distorted and strange, as if they didn't belong in this world. Panic clawed at me. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the loose gravel. I didn't stop until I reached the car, my chest heaving with each breath. When I glanced back at the lighthouse, it was silent. The figure was gone. I still don't know what I saw that night. All I know is, I never returned to the lighthouse. Some things are better left untouched, left to the silence and the darkness where they belong. It was a hot summer evening, and I had decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The sun had set hours ago, leaving behind a deep, velvety darkness that seemed to stretch forever. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a porch light, casting long shadows down the sidewalks. I lived in an old, quiet suburban neighborhood that had once been bustling, but now felt hollow and deserted. Most of the houses were dark, their windows blank and lifeless. As I walked, I noticed the silence. No chirping of crickets, no rustling leaves. It was unnaturally still. The only sounds were the faint echoes of my own footsteps against the cracked pavement. Halfway through my walk, I noticed something off about the house 2 doors down from mine. Its porch light was flickering, buzzing faintly, like it couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be on or off. The windows were dark, and there was a strange emptiness to the place, as if the house itself had been abandoned long ago. But the most unsettling part was the shape standing by the front door. A tall, thin figure cloaked in shadow. At first, I thought it was just the edge of a tree or a dark outline of the house. But then I saw it move. Slowly, deliberately. The figure didn't seem human. It wasn't walking like someone lost or wandering. It moved with purpose, as if it were waiting, watching for something. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me wanted to turn and run. I wanted to shout, to call out, but something held me frozen in place. The figure tilted its head, staring in my direction. I could barely make out its outline, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, the way it stood so still, yet seemed entirely aware of my presence. Slowly, it began to move towards me, taking long, measured steps. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped, rooted to the spot. The figure was almost close enough to make out its features when suddenly, without warning, it stopped. It stood there, facing me, just a few yards away. The silence stretched so thick I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then, without any discernible reason, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, almost mechanical, like it had been recorded and played back. "You should not be here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. I tried to take a step backward, but my body wouldn't move. The figure began to step closer again, and I could feel my panic rising. It tilted its head again, tilting toward me as if it was studying something. Then, almost too quietly to hear, it whispered, "You should have left already." Suddenly, everything snapped back into focus. My legs moved on their own, and I bolted down the street, adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't look back, not once, until I was safely back home, slamming the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The figure's words haunted me. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human. And I pray I never see it again. It was a quiet evening, and I had decided to go for a walk along the old, unused rail trail that ran near the edge of town. The trail had been out of service for decades, overgrown with thick underbrush and left to the elements. A relic from another time, it was now little more than a forgotten path through the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trail. I didn't expect to run into anyone. The town had grown quiet in recent years, and I figured it was the perfect time to clear my head. There wasn't much to hear other than the distant sound of the trees rustling in the wind and the occasional creak of an old sign swaying overhead. As I walked further along the trail, a chill started to settle in my bones. It wasn't just the cold air. There was something off about the silence, something unnatural. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. I shook it off, blaming my nerves, and pressed on. About halfway down the trail, I came across an old wooden bench. It was weathered and half-rotted, covered in moss and dirt. I decided to sit for a moment, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The woods around me seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, the wind sharper. I glanced up at the fading light of the horizon, the last hint of twilight vanishing into the thick trees. That's when I heard it, a faint, barely audible whisper carried on the wind. I strained to hear, but there was nothing, just the silence again. Maybe my imagination, I thought. But then, a second whisper, closer this time, like it was coming from the trees behind me. My breath hitched and I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. The woods were still. The trees loomed over the trail like silent sentinels, their branches creaking and swaying. I told myself to calm down, that it was probably just an animal. But deep down, I knew better. There was no animal making those whispers. It was like something, or someone, was trying to call out to me. I tried to walk away from the bench, but the whispers followed. They were louder now, as if they were closing in on me, their words indistinct but somehow menacing. I glanced behind, but there was nothing. Only the trees, silent and watchful. The trail curved ahead, disappearing into the shadows. I kept moving, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from all directions now, surrounding me like a dark fog. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was I losing my mind? Or was something out there? Something beyond explanation. Suddenly, I tripped over something in the grass, falling hard onto the dirt path. My hands scraped against the ground as I caught myself. Looking down, I saw it. A small, broken mirror lying face up, shards of glass reflecting nothing but my terrified expression. The whispers turned to a low, guttural whisper, almost like a chant. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but I could feel it resonating in my bones. I scrambled to my feet, my heart thudding wildly in my chest. That's when I saw them. Shadowy figures emerging from the trees. They weren't human, but they moved like people. Tall and hunched, their forms twisted and obscured by the dark. Their eyes glowed faintly, empty and hollow. They didn't speak, but their whispers continued, growing louder. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The shadows moved closer, closing in on me like a wave of darkness. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they stopped. The whispers faded, and the figures vanished into the trees once more. I stood there, breathless, staring into the darkness. When I dared to move again, there was nothing, only the echo of silence. The mirror lay shattered on the ground, its broken glass reflecting nothing but the void of the forest. I didn't stay long after that. I turned around and walked back, never looking over my shoulder again. It was just a quiet evening walk. I lived near a small town with few places to go. The woods always felt a little too close, too oppressive, but I had always found peace in the stillness of the forest. That night, after dinner, I decided to take a stroll down the old, barely used path that led to the edge of the woods. The sun had just set, leaving a thin strip of light that barely illuminated the ground. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something faint and unfamiliar. I shrugged it off, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I walked. The path was overgrown, the grass brushing against my legs as I made my way deeper into the woods. As I moved further, I noticed how quiet it had become. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just a suffocating silence. It wasn't unusual for the woods to feel deserted, but this felt different. The usual comforting stillness was now oppressive, almost as if the trees themselves were watching me. I kept walking, pushing forward until I stumbled upon something strange. There, just off the path, was an old, weathered cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, the wood faded and rotting, with a thin layer of ivy growing over the walls. I stopped, my curiosity overpowering the gnawing sense of unease that had settled in my gut. There were no signs of life. No lights, no smoke from a chimney. The windows were covered in grime, and the door hung slightly ajar. I stood there, unsure why I was even considering stepping closer. But something about it drew me in. I crept closer, my footsteps crunching against the dirt. The door creaked as I pushed it open just enough to peek inside. The darkness beyond was complete, thick and suffocating. My flashlight barely cut through the shadows, revealing broken furniture, dusty remnants of a life that had long been abandoned. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped inside. The air inside the cabin smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. The silence was absolute. I kept moving through the rooms, uneasy with each creak of the old floorboards beneath me. That's when I noticed it. The faintest sound, a soft whisper, carried through the stillness. It wasn't coming from the cabin itself, but from outside, a whisper that seemed to echo from deep within the woods. I froze, listening intently. The whisper didn't make any sense. No words, just a soft, chilling hum, as if something was calling out. I didn't know why I did it, but I stepped toward the window, pressing my forehead against the cold glass, trying to see into the darkness outside. There was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the oppressive silence. And then I heard it again, closer this time. A faint scraping sound like nails dragging across wood. I jerked back, my breath hitching. The whispers had stopped, but now I could hear something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the underbrush. Panic surged through me and I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the source of the sound. But there was nothing there. Only trees, their twisted shapes looming in the dark. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps came closer, impossibly close now, though there was still nothing to be seen. My breath came out in ragged gasps, each step echoing louder, more deliberate. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the sound stopped. The cabin was silent once again. I didn't wait to find out what was out there. I ran, not bothering to glance back. The woods felt alive, shifting around me, the trees now towering like silent watchers. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the open road, the lights of my town flickering far in the distance. Even now, I wonder what might have been waiting in the shadows. It was a quiet summer evening when my family and I decided to visit the old abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The place had been closed for years, overtaken by weeds and forgotten rides rusting in the hot sun. The locals had always whispered strange stories about the park, rumors of eerie sounds, forgotten laughter, and ghostly apparitions. But we figured it'd be a fun adventure, something different from the usual weekend routines. As we arrived, the first thing that struck me was how still everything felt. There wasn't even the usual hum of insects, just a deathly silence. The entrance gate was broken, hanging open, as though it had been waiting for us. We made our way inside, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet echoing unnaturally loud. The park was larger than I had imagined, with rows of rides that looked like they had been forgotten by time. There was something eerie about the way the rides loomed over us, standing still, lifeless. The Ferris wheel sat motionless, its metal skeleton creaking as though it wanted to move, but couldn't. The funhouse with its broken windows looked like a hollow, crooked mouth, waiting to swallow whatever dared enter. We wandered through the park, taking it all in. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. There was a strange smell, something metallic, mixed with decay. My dad insisted we move closer to the central plaza where the old carousel still stood. It was one of the last working attractions before the park shut down. But it wasn't just the carousel that caught my attention, it was the voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, whispering soft murmurs. But as we approached the plaza, I realized the sounds were coming from the carousel itself. A soft, eerie laughter. The kind of laughter that didn't belong in a place like this. Probably just the wind, Dad said, though his voice was quieter now, uncertain. But the laughter continued. Clearer, louder. It wasn't the wind. I stopped, frozen in my tracks. The sound came from the empty carousel, the horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted faces worn and cracked. I could hear them. Soft, childlike giggles, high-pitched and wrong, echoing across the dead park. Mom tried to assure me it was nothing. "It's just the old ride settling," she said, though her voice was shaky. But the laughter grew, becoming more distorted, more human. It didn't sound like kids playing. It sounded like something wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My skin crawled. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was as if something was there, something else. Dad grabbed my hand and pulled me along, saying we needed to leave, but something about that laughter kept following us. We rushed toward the exit, passing the old concession stand. But then, just as we neared the gate, the air grew colder. The silence became louder again, like a vacuum. That's when I noticed it. The Ferris wheel, still sitting there, its broken lights flickering. Only, it wasn't empty anymore. At the top of the Ferris wheel, a figure stood, motionless, staring down at us with hollow, empty eyes. There was no face, no features, just a void where the eyes should be. And that laughter, that awful, distorted laughter, came from it. I turned to my family, screaming to run, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. The Ferris wheel lights stopped flickering, plunging the park back into darkness. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. We got into the car and drove away as fast as we could, the laughter still ringing in my ears. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was there, it wasn't human, and it never left that amusement park. It was a quiet evening, and I was driving down a deserted highway, the kind where the road stretches endlessly with nothing but fields and trees on either side. I had been driving for hours, heading home after a long trip, and the dim glow of my headlights was the only source of light in the endless blackness around me. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though no storms had come. The tires hummed on the road, and the only sound was the rhythmic click of the wipers clearing the occasional drops from my windshield. I hadn't seen another car in hours, not since leaving the last town, and I felt that familiar sense of isolation creeping in. As I turned a bend, the first thing I noticed was the old wooden sign. It was weathered and barely legible, but I could make out the faint outline of the words, Eagle Point, 5 miles. I didn't remember seeing a town named Eagle Point on any map, but the sign wasn't particularly unusual, just another small forgotten place along this endless stretch of road. I was tempted to speed up, eager to get home, but something about that sign pulled me in. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange sense of solitude that had settled over the drive. I took a slow turn down the narrow, winding road that led toward Eagle Point. As I approached, the first thing I noticed was how dark everything had become. The streetlights in this part of the country were practically non-existent. The only light came from the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the night. Eagle Point wasn't much of a town. A few houses stood in various states of disrepair, the yards overgrown and dotted with wildflowers and weeds. There was no one outside, no cars, no movement, just a stillness that seemed to stretch forever. I drove slowly through the quiet streets, my senses on edge. That's when I saw the church. It wasn't like the other buildings. It was old, its steeple towering above the others, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. There was something unsettling about it, the way the windows reflected the light like hollow, staring eyes. I slowed down and parked across the street, unsure of why I felt so drawn to it. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the church. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the sound of crunching gravel echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open slightly as I pushed it, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the faint light from my phone. The pews were empty, and the air smelled musty, old. The silence felt heavier here. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like the church itself was holding its breath, waiting. I wandered further inside, drawn by an odd sense of fascination and dread. In one corner of the church, there was an old faded photo framed and sitting atop a small altar. It depicted a group of people, women, men, and children, standing together, smiling. But their eyes were empty, vacant. As I stared at the photo, I felt my skin crawl. The stillness grew deeper, more suffocating. Then, from the back of the church, I heard it. A faint whisper, too soft to understand, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat and I turned slowly, heart pounding. There was nothing there, just shadows in the corners, stretching and shifting. I backed away from the altar toward the door. That's when I noticed something strange. The photo was gone. In its place was another photo, newly placed on the altar. This one showed me, alone, standing by my car with an empty, hollow stare. Panic gripped me as I snatched the photo and backed toward the door. The whispering had grown louder now, echoing through the church like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was haunting. I stumbled outside, the door slamming behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my heart racing like it might burst. I drove as fast as I could, eyes locked on the road ahead. When I finally dared to look back, the church was gone, just empty fields stretching into the void. I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard. All I know is that some places aren't meant to be revisited. Some places leave you changed, and some places never really leave at all. It was a quiet evening when I decided to take my dog, Max, for a walk through the park. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The park was usually bustling with families and joggers during the day, but by nightfall it became eerily deserted. Tonight, though, something felt different. Off. Max pulled gently at the leash as we wandered deeper into the park, his sharp eyes scanning the darkened trees. I wasn't worried at first, having walked these paths countless times, but tonight the usual calm was replaced by a creeping unease. We passed by the old playground, its swings creaking gently in the breeze. The air felt colder than usual, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the distance like something moving through the underbrush. I stopped, listening. Max froze too, ears perked. "Come on, boy," I murmured, trying to shake off the strange sensation that prickled my skin. We continued walking, but the feeling didn't fade. Every step I took, the sense of being watched grew stronger. It was as though the trees themselves were closing in around us, watching in silence. I glanced back once, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the path behind me was empty. Still, the feeling of being followed remained. As we neared the center of the park, I spotted something strange, a flickering light in the distance. It looked like someone holding a lantern, but there was no sign of a person. My heart quickened. Max growled low in his throat, ears flat against his head. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe someone had lost a flashlight or a phone, nothing to be afraid of. Yet, as we approached the source of the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The glow flickered erratically like it was struggling to stay on. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light went out. I froze, clutching Max's leash tightly. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. "Hello?" My voice broke the silence. I wasn't sure why I spoke. There was no one to answer. Max started pulling harder on the leash, his hackles raised. I could feel his fear radiating through the grip of my hand. I turned around, scanning the shadows beyond the trees, but they were still empty. Suddenly, the air felt heavier, like something was pressing against my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The forest, which usually comforted me with its stillness, now seemed alive, watching, waiting. Then, from behind me, came a voice. Soft, quiet, but not human. "Stop!" I spun around, heart racing. Max barked furiously, his growl turning into a frantic, terrified yelp. I couldn't see anyone, but the voice had come from the direction of the woods, clear and chilling. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Max was pulling at the leash, nearly dragging me now. His ears were pinned flat, and he was growling louder, more desperately. I glanced around, but the park remained as silent and empty as ever. "Let's go, Max," I said, though my legs felt heavy as I turned to leave. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I could feel something, or someone, following us now, always just out of sight. The walk back was one of the longest of my life. Every step felt like I was walking through a nightmare. Max's barks echoed through the trees, but the presence that had followed us remained hidden. When we finally emerged from the park and the streetlights lit the world again, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I glanced back, but there was nothing. No figure, no sound, just silence and the shadows retreating back into the trees. I didn't sleep that night, my mind haunted by the voice and the feeling of being followed. To this day, I wonder what it was, if it was real or something my mind conjured. All I know is, some nights, even under the safety of streetlights, I still feel the weight of those unseen eyes on me. I never thought a simple trip to the library could haunt me like that. It was an ordinary evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I had just finished dinner and decided to visit the library downtown. I'd always loved the quiet, the smell of old books, the calmness of the place. It was something I did regularly, but that night felt different. The library was quiet, like usual, with only a few people scattered around, their heads buried in books or computers. I liked the peaceful hum of pages turning and the faint sound of the old fluorescent lights buzzing above. It felt like time moved slower there. I spent the evening reading, drifting through the stacks until I found myself in the back of the building. That's where the old section was, filled with dusty aged books no one really touched. It was peaceful, almost serene. But something was off. I remember feeling like I was being watched. The feeling started slowly, creeping up on me. I dismissed it at first, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, a faint whispering. I turned, looking around, but there was no one there. The whispering continued, just soft enough that I couldn't make out the words. It was almost as if someone was speaking right next to my ear, but nothing was there. I tried to ignore it, convinced I was imagining things. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I decided to leave, but as I passed the long row of bookshelves, I noticed something strange. At the end of the row stood a figure, tall and thin, just standing there in the dim light. Its face was obscured by the shadow, but its posture was unnervingly unnatural, like it wasn't quite human. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I blinked, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, but when I looked again, the figure hadn't moved. My legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't look away. There was something about it that didn't belong, something wrong. Then, in a voice that wasn't human, it whispered my name, soft but chilling. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and tried to yell for help, but the sound got caught in my throat. Suddenly, the figure turned and disappeared between the rows of books. I stood there, frozen, unsure whether I had imagined it or not. The whispering continued, though fainter now, as though it were coming from within the very walls of the library. I rushed to the entrance, clutching my phone tightly in my hand. I couldn't leave fast enough. As I pushed open the heavy doors, I glanced back one last time. The library was still. Too still. The buzzing fluorescent lights flickered once before dying out, plunging the building into darkness. I never went back to that library. To this day, I don't know if what I saw was real, but the whispering still lingers in the back of my mind, and I'll never forget the figure that vanished between the rows of books. It was late October, the leaves crunching beneath my feet as I made my way down the quiet country road. I had decided to take a long walk that evening, needing some fresh air away from the dull hum of city life. The sun was setting, casting long dark shadows over the rolling hills, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of trees in the breeze. I'd grown up in this area, a small town surrounded by farmland and open spaces. The woods were always eerie at night, but tonight felt different. The air was colder, heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I walked, I noticed how distant the usual sounds of animals had become. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Even the wind had quieted. I reached the edge of the woods, the trees towering like silent sentinels on either side of the road. The sun had nearly set now, leaving only a dim orange glow on the horizon. It was too early to be this dark. That's when I saw it, standing between two trees, perfectly still, a figure watching me from the shadows. It was human-shaped, but there was something off about it. Its posture was wrong, unnatural. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure if I should move or run. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It was like something out of a nightmare, just a shadow in the fading light. My legs felt frozen as I tried to look away, but something held my gaze. Who's there? My voice trembled as I forced the words out. The silence stretched on, and then nothing. No response, no sound of breathing, no movement. I wanted to run. I turned back toward the road, but as I did, I saw another figure appear in the distance, emerging from the opposite side of the woods. This one was even closer than I thought possible. It didn't walk, it glided, silently, effortlessly. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't human. The shape was wrong, distorted, like something had stretched it out of proportion. My mind raced as I backed away, hands trembling, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was nearly at the edge of the road. The two figures, now several feet apart, stood motionless, their black, empty eyes staring toward me. I realized, with a sick feeling in my stomach, that I hadn't heard any footsteps, just silence. And yet they were there, both of them, in the middle of nowhere, watching me. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me as fast as they could, the figures vanishing into the darkness behind me. I never looked back. To this day, I don't know what they were, but I know they weren't human. It started on a normal afternoon, a day like any other. I had taken my son to the old park, the one we used to go to when he was younger. The park had always been a peaceful escape from the city, full of tall trees and winding paths that led nowhere in particular. Today, though, something felt off. We had the whole place to ourselves, which wasn't unusual. It was a weekday, and most people didn't visit parks during these hours. I let my son run ahead, chasing after a frisbee he'd thrown. I stood at the edge of a small pond watching him play. The water rippled under the weight of the afternoon sun, and the sound of the birds was soothing. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, expecting to see another parent or maybe a jogger, but there was no one. Just trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Must be my imagination, I muttered to myself. But as I turned back to the pond, the footsteps came again. This time, closer. My son didn't seem to notice, still lost in his game. I told myself I was just on edge. The woods could make noises feel louder than they were, right? But the footsteps weren't fading. They were steady, relentless. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone had wandered into the park, someone harmless. Still, my heart pounded in my chest and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, trying to find the source of the sound, but saw no one. The footsteps came again, closer this time, circling around the pond. My son, still unaware, continued chasing the frisbee, laughing as he ran. "Stop playing," I shouted, my voice trembling now. "We're leaving." He didn't hear me. Or maybe he didn't care. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure, but my legs felt like they wanted to run. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave him. Then, as I stepped toward the pond, I saw something. Something in the water. It wasn't a reflection. It was a figure. A shadow, floating just beneath the surface. It wasn't moving like anything natural. It seemed to be watching us. Unmoving, unmoving. I took a step back from the water, my breath hitching in my throat. What was it? Some kind of trick of the light? My mind raced, but fear took over. I had to get my son. Come on, I called again, louder this time, my voice breaking. My son didn't seem to hear me. He was too far gone in his play, oblivious to the danger I now felt closing in. I sprinted toward him, my heart screaming with every step. I grabbed his arm, pulling him hard. His laughter stopped, replaced by confusion. "What's wrong, Dad?" "We're leaving." "Now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. As I turned back toward the path, I saw it again. The figure, this time fully visible. It stood at the edge of the pond, watching us. Not human, not animal, something else entirely. Its form was blurred, not entirely solid, but its eyes were unmistakable. Dark, hollow, watching us. I held my son tighter, running, my breath ragged. We didn't look back, didn't stop until we were far away from that place. As we reached the park entrance, I glanced once more over my shoulder. The figure was still there, motionless, watching us. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat, racing through my ears. We never went back to that park, and I never looked into water the same way again. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to go for a drive. I had been feeling restless lately, and the open road seemed like the perfect escape. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and drove aimlessly, taking whatever turns felt right. Eventually, I found myself deep in the countryside, miles from any sign of civilization. The roads twisted and turned, surrounded by nothing but trees and fields. The further I drove, the quieter it became. No cars, no people, just the hum of the engine and the distant chirp of birds. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After a while, I came across an old farmhouse. Its paint was peeling and the windows were dark and empty. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pulled up beside the house, parking a little ways off the dusty driveway. I sat there for a moment, staring at the abandoned building. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right. I decided to get out and take a closer look. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I approached the front door. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface. The house smelled old, like something had been left to rot inside. My breath fogged up the cracked window and I peered inside. It was empty, completely stripped of life. Chairs lay overturned, curtains torn and hanging in tatters. It was as if the house had been waiting for someone to return. As I wandered through the house, a strange feeling settled over me. The air was still, almost too still. It felt as if I wasn't alone. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I called out, but no answer came. It was like the world had gone silent, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if something is breathing just beyond it. Upstairs, I found a room at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar, creaking when I pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with faded furniture and more cobwebs. On the wall was a single photograph, worn and faded, its edges curling up. A family stood there, smiling, though their eyes seemed hollow, their grins fake. The photo sent a chill down my spine. Then I heard a sound from below, a faint, distant thud. My heart skipped a beat. I listened, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking through the house. I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps came from downstairs, echoing up the creaking staircase. I should have run, I knew that, but my legs wouldn't move. The fear had paralyzed me. Then I heard it, the sound of something else, a faint whispering voice. I couldn't make out the words, just the soft murmur as if someone was speaking in another language. It came from below, growing louder, as if whatever it was had found its way into the house. tears filled my eyes as I forced myself to move. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to go back to the front door. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I moved slowly down the stairs, each creak beneath my feet sounding louder than the last. At the front door, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I had never been more afraid in my life. The whispers had grown so loud, they felt like they were in my head. I turned the knob, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the daylight. The house looked different from the outside, somehow darker, more twisted. I expected to see someone standing there watching me, but there was nothing, just the empty fields stretching out before me. The whispering faded, and the silence returned. I drove away without looking back. The house stayed with me, though. The image of that photograph, the whispering voice, it all felt too real. I don't know what I experienced that day, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. The night sky stretched endlessly above the old train tracks. We were out there, just friends on a camping trip, away from everything. No phones, no towns, just the woods and the faint sound of a distant train. It was supposed to be peaceful, a night of campfires, laughter, and staring up at the stars. But everything changed when we stumbled across the old station. We hadn't planned on visiting it. It wasn't on any map, but curiosity led us off the trail. The station had been abandoned for decades, weathered by time and overgrown with vines. The roof had caved in, leaving skeletal beams exposed. It was eerie, but we thought it would make a cool spot to rest for a while. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. The wooden floor groaned underfoot, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like thin curtains. We joked about the ghosts, making light of the old station's dark past, but something didn't feel right. As we wandered deeper into the building, one of my friends, Emily, stopped abruptly, staring at the wall. We all gathered around, shining our flashlights where she pointed. The wall was covered in writing. Scrawled in faded, jagged letters were words that made my blood run cold. "Help us." None of us spoke. We stood there, frozen, as if the very silence around us was pressing down. There were other messages, scratched out beneath, phrases we couldn't make sense of. Words about trains, about waiting, and something else entirely. "They're still coming." That's when the whispers began. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I turned to see if anyone else had heard them, but my friends were motionless, their eyes wide with fear. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. It felt like they were closing in on us. We bolted from the building, running back toward our campsite, the sound of our footsteps drowned out by the endless rustling of the trees. My chest heaved as we made it back to the clearing, but we couldn't escape what followed. Back at the campfire, we all sat in silence, watching the flickering flames. I kept glancing toward the trees, waiting, expecting to hear something again. But it was the quiet that frightened me the most. The rest of the night passed without another sound, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying those words, that feeling of being watched. Even now, I wonder what was meant by those messages, and if they're still out there, waiting. We left the station behind, but the memories of what we saw have never left me. The train is long gone, but I know they're still out there. The night had been uneventful at first. I had decided to take a long drive along the old highway that cut through the desolate plains. It wasn't a particularly scenic route, just endless stretches of cracked pavement and empty fields, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. The only light came from my headlights and the occasional flicker of my dashboard. The quiet was almost oppressive. I usually enjoyed solitude, but this felt different, more isolated, more oppressive. As I drove, I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the headlights of another vehicle trailing behind. But there was nothing. No other cars, no signs of life, just the endless road and the hum of my engine. It wasn't until I reached a stretch of road where the horizon curved slightly that something caught my attention. Off to the side, barely visible beneath a thick layer of dust and fog, was an old gas station. I couldn't recall ever seeing it before, but something about it made me slow down. The building was worn, paint peeling, and the sign above it flickered weakly in the night. I decided to stop. It wasn't as if I had much else to do. My phone had lost a signal hours ago and the gas gauge was hovering near empty. Pulling into the station, I cut the engine and stepped out into the stillness. The air was colder than I expected, biting at my skin as I stretched. The station looked abandoned. Cobwebs clung to the windows, and the front door creaked ominously when I pushed it open. Inside, everything was coated in dust. The aisles were empty, shelves leaning precariously, and there was a heavy silence that pressed down on me. I checked the register. Empty. The shelves were stocked, but there wasn't a single item that looked untouched in decades. My footsteps echoed as I wandered further inside, drawn by a sense of curiosity mixed with unease. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper on the edge of hearing. I stopped, my breath hitching. The noise wasn't coming from inside. It was outside, near the side of the building, like someone was dragging something heavy across the gravel. I moved toward the door and cracked it open. Nothing but the dark stretch of road and the fog that clung to the horizon. My heart thumped harder, and I stepped back inside, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. But then, I heard it again, closer this time. A dragging sound, slower, heavier. I didn't dare go outside, but I stood frozen, waiting for whatever it was to come into view. The noise stopped, as if whatever had been making it had reached the edge of the building, and then silence again. I forced myself to move, back toward the register. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, trying to reconnect to any signal, but the screen stayed blank. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still watching. I had almost convinced myself to leave when I heard a voice. Soft. Low. Hello? My stomach twisted. It wasn't like any human voice I'd ever heard. Hollow, distorted, as though the words had been dragged through something sinister. I backed further into the station, heart racing. "Who's there?" I called, but my voice shook. The silence stretched, then came the whisper again, closer. "Why are you here?" I didn't have an answer. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe someone was playing some kind of cruel prank, or maybe I was losing my mind. But there was no way to rationalize what was happening. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the fog, moving with an unnatural gait. Its limbs were too long, bent at angles they shouldn't have been. Its face was shadowed, but I could see eyes, dark, hollow pits where the light should have been. I stumbled backward, knocking into a shelf. "No! No!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The thing didn't respond. It continued to move toward me, silent but relentless. Desperation set in. I didn't think, I just ran, back toward the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I shoved the door open, not even bothering to check behind me. The fog outside was thicker now, swallowing the road, the station, everything. I sprinted, not caring where I was going, only knowing I couldn't stay there. My legs burned, but I didn't stop, didn't look back, not until I found my car and jumped inside. When I glanced in the rear-view mirror, there was nothing there, just the road, stretching on endlessly. But I knew whatever had followed me, whatever had been waiting in the shadows of that gas station, wasn't gone. It was still out there, and it wouldn't stop. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker, someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching. It was late at night, and I was driving home from a family gathering. The roads were mostly empty, the only sound being the occasional hum of my tires on the asphalt. I wasn't particularly familiar with this route. My usual path was blocked off due to some road work, but it was the quickest detour I could take. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the landscape changed. The city lights faded behind me, leaving only dark fields and dense trees. The silence grew oppressive. I had this strange feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, but I brushed it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. About 20 minutes into the detour, I passed a small, ancient-looking church. Its steeple pierced through the night sky, its silhouette standing stark against the dim moonlight. The church looked abandoned, with vines creeping up its sides, and the windows were shattered, filled with dirt and cobwebs. I shivered despite the warm breeze. As I drove by, my headlights briefly illuminated the graveyard surrounding the church. Tombstones leaned at odd angles, some half buried in the earth. The whole scene felt eerily still, like it wasn't part of this world. I tried to shake the unease that settled in my stomach and pressed on, telling myself it was just an old church. It was the next turn that unnerved me. The road curved sharply into a dense forest. The trees loomed high, their branches interlocking like dark claws above me. The air grew colder, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. My headlights barely cut through the fog that had begun to roll in. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The feeling that I was being watched grew stronger. I kept telling myself I was overthinking things, but my pulse quickened with each passing second. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A low, hollow whispering. It was so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it, but it repeated, clear as day. Follow. I froze. The whisper wasn't coming from inside the car. It seemed to be carried on the wind, drifting from the trees around me. My fingers went numb as I clutched the steering wheel tighter. I scanned the forest, searching for the source, but the trees were motionless, their shadows stretching endlessly. Follow. This time, it was closer. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to drive away, but my foot wouldn't move. I didn't know if it was fear or something else keeping me there. Suddenly, my headlights flickered. The noise of the engine seemed to fade into the whispering. I could barely hear the tires on the road beneath me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible through the thick fog. Its outline was dark and impossibly tall. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I should have turned around then, should have left, but my body felt paralyzed. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Follow. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Without thinking, I found myself inching the car forward, the figure still staring, unmoving. It was like it was beckoning me, luring me deeper into the unknown. I don't know how long I drove. The road twisted and turned, every mile feeling longer than the last. The whisper didn't stop, growing louder, as if I were being led deeper into the woods, into whatever nightmare lurked ahead. Finally, the whisper faded. The trees grew thinner. The fog cleared slightly, and I found myself driving onto a dirt path. Ahead of me was a clearing, bathed in moonlight. In the center stood the church, its shattered windows now gleaming with an otherworldly glow. My heart pounded as I realized the figure was gone. I hesitated, my hands still gripping the wheel, but something compelled me to stop. I didn't know why. My legs felt like they were moving on their own. I stepped out of the car, the ground beneath my feet cold and wet. I approached the church, the whisper now replaced by silence. My footsteps echoed in the stillness. When I reached the church, I stared at the cracked entrance, frozen with fear. But there was nothing. No figure, no whispers, no voices, just an old, abandoned church standing in the cold, dead night. And as I turned to leave, I realized the face I had seen in the cracked window wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's. It was just a normal Sunday afternoon, and I had decided to take a long drive out to the outskirts of town. The weather was crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes you want to get away from the noise of the city. I hadn't been out this way before, but something about the empty roads and open fields had always called to me. I drove down winding country roads, surrounded by endless fields of tall grass. It was so quiet that the only sounds were the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air smelled fresh, and for once there was no one around. I appreciated the peace, letting my mind wander. As I drove, I noticed an old barn sitting off in the distance. It wasn't much, just a weathered wooden structure surrounded by overgrown weeds, but something about it tugged at me. I couldn't quite explain why, but I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. So I decided to take a detour, leaving the main road behind. When I parked and stepped out of the car, the silence was overwhelming. It wasn't a comforting silence, though. It felt oppressive, as if the very earth was holding its breath. I approached the barn cautiously. The wood creaked beneath my feet as I made my way closer. The door hung open slightly, swinging faintly in the breeze. I hesitated but stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint slivers of sunlight that managed to filter through cracks in the old wood. The place smelled like damp hay and decay. My footsteps echoed, the sound amplified in the stillness. The barn wasn't empty. In the far corner, partially hidden by shadows, stood something tall and thin. I wasn't sure what it was. At first, I thought it was just old farm equipment or debris. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't. It wasn't human, but neither was it entirely unfamiliar. Its form was elongated, with arms that seemed too long, bending unnaturally. Its face, if you could call it that, was hollow and void, no features to speak of, just a black void where the eyes should have been. It stood completely still, like a statue, as if waiting. My heart raced. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. It felt like the barn had shifted, trapping me in a place with some unseen force. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It simply stood there, watching. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice in the way we think of it. It was more of a whispering thought that seemed to echo inside my own head. "Why are you here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The barn door creaked louder, and I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The oppressive silence returned, but now there was something else. Something watching. The figure in the corner shifted, just slightly, as if it had taken a step toward me. My legs finally moved, carrying me in a frantic stumble toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I looked back, catching a glimpse of something in the shadows. It wasn't just the figure now. There were more, a dozen, maybe more, standing motionless in the dark corners of the barn, all watching me with those empty voids for eyes. I couldn't escape them. The door wouldn't open. I turned back, heart pounding, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The barn felt like it was closing in, folding around me. Then I saw it, the face of one of them, so close now. It was right in front of me, and still it didn't have eyes, just a featureless black void. And yet, I felt it staring deep into me, past my skin and into my soul. The whisper came again. Louder now. "Why are you here?" This time, I heard my own voice answer, trembling and weak. I don't know, but I did know. I knew something had been waiting for me. It wanted something I couldn't understand. In that moment, I realized that leaving the barn wasn't an option, and neither was forgetting. I was on a road trip with my friends, driving through an unfamiliar desert. The sun was beating down on the cracked pavement, and the silence of the empty highway stretched endlessly ahead. We had been driving for hours. No signs of civilization in sight, just mile after mile of barren desert landscape. We were all growing restless, desperate for some kind of break from the monotony. The only thing in view was the occasional stretch of cracked road in the distant horizon, where the desert seemed to blend into the sky. My friends and I decided to pull off onto a small dirt track we'd seen about a mile back. The track led to an old abandoned building. Once a gas station, now nothing but rubble and dust. The sun had bleached the place dry, leaving only broken windows and faded remnants of faded signage. It looked like it had been there for decades, forgotten by time. "We should check it out," Mark said, breaking the silence. We cautiously made our way through the debris, the crunch of our footsteps disturbing the quiet. The inside of the building was eerily quiet. The dust that coated everything made it feel like the place hadn't seen human presence in a lifetime. We explored the remains, poking through old cabinets and peeling wallpaper, but found nothing of any real value. That's when we noticed it. At first, we didn't know what it was. A faint metallic hum, like something electrical, coming from somewhere deeper inside the building. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't subtle either. We followed the sound down what was left of the hallway, the old wooden floor creaking beneath us. At the end of the hall, we found a door that was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, we saw a narrow staircase leading down into a dark basement. The hum grew louder as we descended, the air growing colder with each step. I could feel the tension rising in my chest, the kind that makes your skin crawl. The basement was a mess. Collapsed shelves, broken tools scattered across the floor. But the hum wasn't coming from any of that. It was coming from an old metal door at the far end of the room. The door was covered in rust with no visible handle. Mark walked toward it, his flashlight shaking slightly as he pointed it at the door. "What is this thing?" he muttered. I didn't know. None of us did. The hum grew almost unbearable as we got closer. My heart was pounding in my chest as I realized there was something on the other side. I reached out, placing my hand on the door. The noise stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I turned to the others, but they were frozen, staring at me like I was the only one who could move. Then something changed. A faint scraping noise began. It came from behind the door, slow and deliberate, as if something on the other side was dragging itself closer. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to. "Guys," I whispered, my voice trembling. Mark's eyes were wide, his flashlight now trembling more violently. "Open the door," he managed to choke out. I hesitated. I didn't want to. But the scraping was getting louder, the sound of something, or someone, dragging itself across the floor behind the metal door. Without realizing what I was doing, I turned the knob. The door swung open. There was nothing, at least not anything we could see. The room beyond was empty, just more dust, darkness, and a strange, inexplicable silence. But as I stepped forward, I felt something cold, like fingers brushing against my back. It wasn't just a sensation. It was as if something was there, something that didn't belong. My friends weren't behind me anymore. I turned to call out to them, but they were gone. The basement was empty and the metal door was still open behind me. I couldn't explain what happened. I never could. I looked for them after that, searched the entire area, but there was no trace. No sign of my friends, no footprints, nothing. To this day, I wonder what we found in that desert. Whatever it was, I hope I never see it again. The day had started off ordinary, just another lazy afternoon. I decided to explore the old abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place everyone whispered about but no one dared to enter. The house had always been shrouded in mystery, sitting at the edge of the forest like a relic from another time. The locals said strange things happened there, whispers in the night, disappearing pets, shadows in the corners of windows. I parked my car on the gravel path and made my way toward the house. The old wooden planks groaned beneath my feet, each step echoing eerily in the quiet. The front door creaked open without much resistance, revealing a dark, empty interior. Dust covered everything and the air smelled of decay. I walked through the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. Furniture had been overturned, and old photos lay scattered on the floor, their faces faded beyond recognition. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath my weight. As I wandered deeper into the house, I began to hear something. Faint whispers, barely audible but persistent. I paused, holding my breath. straining to make out what they were saying. It was almost like the house itself was murmuring secrets, as if the walls were alive with memories. I shook off the chill that ran down my spine and pressed on. The whispers grew louder as I reached the top of the staircase. They seemed to be coming from the room at the end of the hall. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed open the door. Inside, the room was bare except for an old mirror standing in the corner. It was cracked, its glass dull and warped. I couldn't look away, compelled by some strange force. As I stared into the mirror, I saw my reflection distort, my face twisting, becoming something wrong. The whispers became screams, louder now, echoing in my ears. I stumbled back, the distorted figure in the mirror now staring at me, its hollow eyes gleaming. I could feel it watching me, not just in the reflection, but in the real world. My breath came in shallow gasps and I backed away from the mirror, tripping over the furniture as I fled the room. As I ran down the hall, I glanced behind me and caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, black and shifting, racing after me. I could hear it breathing, ragged and uneven, closing the distance between us. I burst out of the house, the door slamming shut behind me. The air outside was thick, oppressive, and silent once again. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I've never returned to that farmhouse. The whispers still echo in my ears, and sometimes I swear I see that shadow lurking just at the edge of my vision. Whatever was in that house, whatever was chasing me, it's still there, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just me, my wife, and our old tent. We had decided to spend the weekend camping at a quiet spot far from town, a remote forest preserve where we hadn't been before. No phone service, no distractions, just nature. We had always loved the quiet, the peace. That night, we pitched our tent by the edge of a small misty lake. The sound of frogs croaking and the distant rustling of leaves filled the air. For a while, everything felt perfect. As darkness fell, we sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and chatting about nothing in particular. The forest was alive with sounds, the occasional hoot of an owl, the scuttling of small animals in the underbrush. But there was one sound that didn't fit. Something soft and irregular, almost mechanical. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was the wind. But then it stopped, only to start again, closer this time. It was a faint rhythmic thud, like someone lightly tapping a tree. I glanced around, but the woods were dark and quiet, save for that strange noise. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. "What's that noise?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My wife furrowed her brow, listening intently. "I don't know. It's probably just something out there." I didn't believe her. The tapping wasn't like any natural sound we'd heard before. It felt deliberate, almost as if something, or someone, was pacing the perimeter of our campsite. "We should head to bed," I suggested, trying to mask my unease. We snuffed out the fire and climbed into the tent, pulling the flaps closed behind us. The sound followed us. The rhythmic tapping continued, now louder, more insistent. It wasn't far. It was coming from just beyond the edge of the trees, and whatever it wasn't stopping. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every few minutes I woke, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound seemed closer now, more deliberate. The faint rustling of leaves wasn't wind, it was movement. Then something shifted in the darkness. I saw it, a pair of pale eyes staring at us from between the trees. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. I held my breath, frozen with fear. My wife stirred beside me, unaware of the figure just outside the tent. I could barely hear her breathing over the pounding of my heart. After what felt like hours, the eyes blinked and vanished. The tapping stopped. The forest went silent again, but this time, the silence was worse. In the morning, we crept out of the tent, both of us pale and exhausted. The forest was still, but something felt off, unnaturally still. My wife pointed at the ground, her voice trembling. "Footprints," she said. I followed her gaze to the soft earth around our campsite. There were clear, human-like footprints leading away from the tent and into the woods, but they didn't belong to us. We never found out what was watching us that night. We packed our things and left the forest behind, leaving the strange footprints and the silent eyes in the dark. To this day, I wonder what might have happened if we hadn't left. It was supposed to be a simple day trip. A group of us decided to explore the old, overgrown garden at the edge of town, a place none of us had visited since we were kids. The garden had once been a lush, vibrant place, but now it was a tangled mess of weeds, broken pathways, and twisted trees. We thought it would be a fun adventure, a walk down memory lane, but it ended up being something far more unsettling. The entrance was narrow and hidden by thick undergrowth. We pushed our way through the brambles, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot echoing in the silence. The garden seemed abandoned, almost forgotten. It wasn't large, just a few acres, but there was an eerie stillness to it that felt unnatural. We wandered further in, the air growing heavier as the afternoon wore on. The garden was overgrown, the trees towering above us like silent sentinels. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted in ways that made it feel as though something was always watching us. But none of us said a word. We were too caught up in the nostalgia, the sense of exploration. As we continued walking, we stumbled across a strange sight, a large, old stone fountain at the center of the garden. The fountain had been drained long ago, cracked and moss-covered, but there was something off about it. The water had long since dried up, but beneath the surface, something glimmered, an unnatural glint of metal. One of my friends decided to investigate. He climbed over the broken edge of the fountain, peering down into the dark depths. We watched as he ran his flashlight over the cracked stone, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion. "There's something down there," he said, his voice shaking. We all gathered closer, peering over the edge. The glint wasn't just metal. It was a narrow, distorted shape, like a long piece of twisted metal, sticking out from the bottom of the fountain. None of us could make sense of it. It was too unnatural, too strange. One of my friends cautiously lowered a stick down, trying to probe at whatever was below, but it didn't budge. No sound, no shift. It was like whatever was down there wasn't meant to be disturbed. The unease settled deeper into our bones. "Let's get out of here," someone said, their voice trembling. None of us argued. We started to back away, but as we turned to leave, the air grew colder. A sense of dread clung to us, as though the garden itself didn't want us to leave. That's when we heard the sound, soft, almost imperceptible, a whisper drifting through the trees. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the rustling of leaves, it was a voice, so faint we could barely hear it, calling out from the shadows. "Stay, stay with us." I felt my skin crawl. We all stood frozen, the words echoing in our ears. The voice didn't come from any of us, and it didn't seem human. It was hollow, distorted, like it was coming from something far away, yet impossibly close. "Did you hear that?" someone whispered, their breath ragged. None of us dared to speak. The whisper came again, louder this time, and this time I could make out the words, "Stay with us." I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look, but we couldn't move, paralyzed by the sound. The garden had become something else entirely, a place that no longer belonged to us. "Run!" someone finally shouted, breaking the spell. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted through the tangled underbrush, crashing through the trees, fear driving us faster with every step. Behind us, the whispers continued, growing louder. "Stay. Stay with us." We didn't stop until we burst out of the garden, back into the light, our hearts pounding. When we looked back, there was nothing there. No whispers, no figures, nothing. Just the silence of the trees. None of us dared to speak about it again. The garden was still there, but it had changed. Whatever had called to us, whatever had tried to pull us back, was still out there. We never went back. I still don't know how it started. I was on a family trip, just a quiet weekend getaway to an old, abandoned lighthouse by the sea. The kind of place that was supposed to be peaceful, isolated from everything, with nothing but the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. It was just me, my parents, and my sister. The lighthouse towered over us, weathered by time and ocean spray, its white paint flaking off like skin peeling from old wounds. The first day, everything seemed normal. We explored the surrounding cliffs, took photos of the rocky coastline, and enjoyed the solitude. But as night fell, something shifted. We'd set up camp near the base of the lighthouse, far enough away from the cliffs to feel safe, but close enough that the ocean was always within earshot. It was late when I went to sleep, the air thick with the scent of salt and damp earth. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was my parents or sister talking, but when I opened my eyes, I was alone. The tent was silent except for the crashing waves. Still, the voices continued, low murmurs, too faint to make out but unmistakably there, just outside the tent. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe I was dreaming. I lay there, frozen, trying to ignore it. But then the whispering stopped, and I heard footsteps, soft and deliberate, creeping around the outside of the tent. My heart pounded as I gripped the edge of the sleeping bag. I wanted to call out, but the words stuck in my throat. The footsteps circled the tent, slower now, as if they were inspecting it. The rustling of grass sounded too close, like someone was brushing against the fabric. I forced myself to stay still, waiting for the footsteps to fade. But they didn't. Instead, they grew louder, dragging closer until they were right beside me. I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, shallow and uneven, like someone struggling to stay quiet. Then, out of nowhere, a deep, hollow voice spoke. "Let me in." I couldn't scream. My breath hitched as I stared at the fabric of the tent, the sound of the voice lingering in my ears. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Terror gripped me, but I managed to unzip the tent a little, just enough to peek outside. The moonlight barely cut through the darkness, but I could make out a figure standing there. Its shape was distorted, almost unnatural. Too tall, too thin, with skin that shimmered under the moonlight like water. Its face was obscured, shrouded in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would disappear if I couldn't see it. When I opened them again, the figure was gone. The footsteps had stopped, and the silence returned. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my sister's hand when she woke up too. None of us spoke of what happened. We packed up quietly at dawn, trying to act like nothing was out of the ordinary. To this day, I can still hear those whispers. They haunt me every time I hear the ocean. Whatever was out there didn't follow us home, but I know it's still out there, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip with a group of friends. We decided to take a hike through a dense, unfamiliar forest. No cabins, no gas stations, just trees and nature for miles. I wasn't the outdoorsy type, but something about getting away from the city's chaos sounded appealing. We parked at a trailhead that felt like it hadn't seen visitors in years. The road was overgrown, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Our group of 5 took our first steps into the forest, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. It was peaceful, serene, or so I thought. About an hour into the hike, things began to feel off. The path we'd been following seemed to narrow, the trees closing in around us. We'd all become quiet, unsure if we were heading the right way. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, distant birds, had fallen silent. It was like we were walking through some uncharted, forgotten place. "Are we even on the trail anymore?" one of my friends asked, her voice uncertain. I stopped and looked around. The trees were so thick, and the sunlight barely broke through. It felt unnatural. But before I could suggest turning back, we noticed something strange. A figure, just a glimpse, moving deeper into the woods. "Did anyone else see that?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible. We all exchanged uneasy glances. The figure had been too tall, too dark. None of us could make out its features, but we could feel its presence. It didn't belong in these woods. "We should follow it," someone said, their voice shaking. Reluctantly, we pressed on. The deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The forest seemed to shift, twisting into something darker. The trees grew taller, the air growing colder. Every step felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath us was resisting our presence. Hours passed, or so it felt. The light grew dim, the woods silent except for the crunch of our footsteps. The figure was always just out of sight, moving further away. We wanted to call out, to demand answers, but our voices felt frozen in our throats. Suddenly, one of my friends stopped walking, their face pale. Where did everyone go?" they whispered. I spun around. The others had vanished. No trace, no sound. Just me and the forest. My heart began to pound in my chest as I realized I was alone, surrounded by trees that felt alive. I called out, but there was no response. My friends had disappeared, and the silence returned. I wandered aimlessly, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to shift with every attempt. It felt like the trees were closing in on me, squeezing me tighter. Then I heard it, a faint whispering. Voices, but not human. They sounded hollow, like they were echoing from the very woods themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was haunting, sorrowful. I tried to run, but my legs gave out, the ground beneath me uneven and slippery. As I struggled to my feet, I saw the figure again. This time it was closer, taller, more menacing. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light, watching me with a dead, hollow stare. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, waiting. I felt something brush against my arm, a cold, bony touch that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to fight back, but whatever was out there was far beyond anything I could comprehend. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. For what felt like hours, I wandered through the woods, not knowing if I was even going in the right direction. I couldn't hear any of my friends, but I knew they couldn't have gone far. The whispering voices persisted, growing louder, more desperate. Finally, I broke through the trees and saw the trailhead, familiar now. The sun was rising, casting long shadows on the ground. My friends were gone, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. I made my way back to the car, breathless and shaken. The forest remained quiet, the eerie calm settling over me like a shroud. My friends were never found. To this day, I've never been able to explain what happened. The woods had taken them, and they took part of me with them, too. I never believed in anything supernatural, not until that night in the old apartment complex. I had just moved to the city, renting a tiny unit on the third floor of a building that felt like it had seen better days. The building wasn't in the best part of town, but it was cheap, and for someone just starting out, it seemed like a good place to lay low. The first night, I didn't think much of the creaking sounds. The building had that old, eerie feel, with narrow hallways that seemed to stretch into the darkness. I figured it was just the building settling, nothing more. But as the days went by, those sounds became harder to ignore. It started subtly. Every evening around the same time, around 11 p.m., the sound would return. It was faint at first, distant, like someone walking, but as the days passed, it got louder, more distinct. It wasn't just footsteps, though. There was a strange, hollow tapping sound that accompanied them. It echoed through the long hallways like someone was knocking on invisible doors. At first, I thought it was just the building's ventilation system acting up. I made excuses, maybe pipes rattling or some old wiring. But one evening, after I heard it again, I decided to investigate. I stepped into the hallway, my breath visible in the dim, flickering lights. The hallway was empty. I could still hear the footsteps, quick and measured like someone was pacing back and forth in the darkness. I followed the sound, stepping cautiously, heart pounding. The hall stretched on forever, the source of the noise always just out of reach. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A figure. At the far end of the hall. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as I realized its face wasn't human. It was a void, empty and hollow, like staring into a bottomless pit. The eyes were black, without any trace of life. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The thing seemed to glide towards me, its footsteps silent, but the sound of its arrival still echoed in my ears. "Let me in," it whispered. I bolted, my legs carrying me back to my apartment faster than I could comprehend. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it and pressing my back against the cold wall. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of what I had just seen. I stayed awake all night, the sound of those footsteps still echoing in my head. The next day, I gathered my courage and told my neighbor, a sweet older woman who had lived there for decades. She just nodded, her face pale. "You saw it too, didn't you?" she said quietly. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had experienced it. Several tenants over the years had reported similar occurrences, footsteps in the hall, the knocking, and that figure. But no one had ever gone into the hall long enough to see what was causing it. That night, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my things in the early morning, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was haunting that building had no intention of ever leaving. I left the keys on the kitchen counter and never looked back. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what was calling from the shadows, but I do know I don't ever want to find out again. It was the kind of day that felt too perfect to be real, the kind of day you only ever see in old photos or travel brochures. My friends and I decided to take a trip out to a secluded beach, tucked away from the usual tourist spots. We'd heard whispers of its beauty from a few locals, but no one really talked about what else might be there. We didn't care. We just wanted the peace and quiet. The drive there was uneventful, winding through winding, narrow roads that twisted through dense forests. The radio played softly, our conversations mellow, as we joked about what kind of adventures awaited us at the shore. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. We finally reached the beach in the late afternoon, the sun already low on the horizon. The sand stretched out in front of us, golden and untouched. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore was soothing. For the first time in a long time, we truly felt free. We spent the day swimming, building sandcastles, and exploring the tide pools. It was idyllic. But as the sun dipped further, casting long shadows across the sand, something started to feel off. The beach, once full of laughter and cheer, grew quiet. The air seemed to thicken, the usual comforting sounds of waves and birds fading into silence. It wasn't that we felt unwelcome, just uneasy, like something was watching. As the last light of the day faded, we gathered our things, feeling reluctant to leave the peaceful stretch of shore behind. I was about to suggest we head back when one of my friends, Laura, stopped dead in her tracks. "Wait, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaky. We all stopped and strained to listen. At first, it was just the sound of the ocean, but then I realized she wasn't talking about the waves. There was something else, a faint, rhythmic thudding, soft but insistent, like something hitting the ground just beyond the edge of the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my stomach tightening. We couldn't see anything, just the dark silhouettes of trees looming beyond the beach. The sound grew louder, closer, and now I was sure I could hear another noise. Whispers. Low, unintelligible voices like they were murmuring right at the edge of hearing. "I think we should go," one of my other friends, Mike, said, his voice barely above a whisper. His face was pale, his eyes wide. Maybe someone's camping out there, Laura suggested, but her words trembled as she spoke. The thudding noise stopped abruptly and the whispers fell silent. A sudden chill swept through the air. It felt like something had just moved, watching us from the darkness. "I think we should go now," I said, my voice firm. The fear in the air was impossible to ignore. We started walking quickly toward the car parked at the edge of the forest. My mind was racing. What could have made that noise? What had those whispers been? As we neared the edge of the woods, something caught my eye. A figure just beyond the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. It was dark, featureless, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I stopped, unable to look away. "Come on," Mike yelled from a few steps ahead. I blinked, shaking my head. The figure was gone. We piled into the car, driving quickly away from the beach. The silence inside was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. None of us spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. That feeling, the sensation of being watched, hadn't left any of us. It wasn't until we were back in town that Laura spoke up again, her voice breaking the silence. "I've never told anyone this, but when I was walking down the beach earlier, I saw something in the water," she said quietly. A face, floating beneath the surface. It wasn't human. We all fell silent. None of us had seen the face she mentioned, but somehow I wasn't surprised. What we heard, what we saw, whatever it was still there, watching from the shadows of the trees. To this day, I haven't returned to that beach. And I never will. It started with the sound of dripping water. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone like any other night. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I live alone, so when I first heard it, I thought maybe it was the refrigerator or the old pipes settling. I got up and checked the kitchen, but the dripping didn't seem to be coming from there. I stood still, listening, and it was coming from upstairs. I didn't think much of it at first. Old houses settle, right? Water can be unpredictable. But the sound persisted, steady and rhythmic. A slow, steady drip that seemed to echo throughout the empty house. I made my way upstairs, my footsteps quiet on the carpet, and checked the bathroom. No leaks. The sound was faint but clear now, coming from the end of the hallway. I stood there, staring down the dark corridor, wondering if maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, it wasn't in my head. It was too consistent, too real. I slowly pushed open the door to the guest room at the end of the hall. That was where the sound was loudest. The room was dark, dusty, and untouched. I flicked on the light switch and the faint glow illuminated the space. The room had been unused for years. An old dresser, a dusty bed frame, and a broken lamp in the corner. Nothing had changed. I listened again. The dripping was definitely coming from inside the room, but this time it wasn't coming from a pipe. It was coming from the closet. I took a deep breath, my pulse quickening, and slowly made my way toward it. The sound of my own breathing seemed louder than the drip, drip, drip. My hand hesitated on the closet door, and then I pulled it open. The inside was dark and empty, except for something unexpected, a single wet patch on the floor. A puddle, but not a puddle of water. It shimmered in the dim light, almost like it wasn't water at all. I knelt down, my heart racing, and touched it. My fingers sank into the substance. It was cold, sticky, and unidentifiable. I pulled my hand away, wiping it on my jeans, and stared into the closet. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse at first. A shape, a figure standing at the back of the closet, facing away from me. It didn't move, didn't react. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of a figure distorted and shifting in the dim light. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stared, unable to look away. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. The silence stretched on, and then, slowly, the figure turned toward me. Its face wasn't human. No eyes, no features, just void. A hollow, dark space where a face should have been. I could feel its gaze on me, and that's when I realized it wasn't there for water or pipes or anything rational. It had been there for me. I forced myself to turn and stumble out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The dripping sound still echoed through my house, but this time, it felt like it was coming from inside me. I still live in that house. The dripping never stopped. I've learned to ignore it, but sometimes, when the house grows too quiet, I swear I can hear the faint sound of footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. It was a quiet evening at home, the kind where the city seems to slow down, and all I could hear was the distant hum of cars passing by. The apartment building where I lived was old, with creaky floorboards and thin walls. I lived on the 4th floor, in a corner unit with windows that looked out over a row of old, weathered rooftops. I was sitting on the couch, engrossed in a book, when I heard the soft, repetitive tapping at my window. At first, I assumed it was just the wind, but when I glanced up, I realized there was no wind. It was perfectly still outside. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I hesitated, my stomach twisting in knots. The apartment felt too quiet now, too still. I didn't want to move, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood slowly, tiptoeing toward the window. I pressed my face to the glass. Below me, in the alley between buildings, there was a figure. It stood completely still, staring up at my window. At first, I couldn't make out much. It was dark, and my view wasn't clear. But then, the figure moved closer, shuffling forward in a slow, unnatural way. Its movements were mechanical, jerky, as if it wasn't fully human. Panic set in as I realized its face was partially obscured, but I could still see the eyes. Empty, hollow, and void of life. They seemed to stare right through me, past the glass. I took a step back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping stopped. Silence followed except for my own breathing. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been. Nothing moved, no sounds from outside. I didn't dare turn away from the window. Minutes passed, but the figure didn't move again. I was about to force myself to look away when, suddenly, the lights flickered. The entire room went dark for a brief second, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The night it happened, I wasn't even supposed to be there. A few friends and I decided on a spontaneous trip to an abandoned train station. It was old, long forgotten, deep in the woods, miles from civilization. The place had always held a strange allure, a remnant from a past that seemed almost mythical. The tracks were overgrown, the station itself crumbling under years of neglect. We hiked out there with flashlights, excited for the eerie adventure. The walk felt normal at first, just trees, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet, and the sounds of creatures in the woods. It wasn't until we reached the station that the mood shifted. The first thing we noticed was the silence. It wasn't the typical woods silence, the kind where animals go quiet at dusk. This was deeper, as if the forest itself had gone still, like something had pressed pause on the world. Even our own voices felt muted, unnatural. We made our way inside the old building. The walls were stained with mildew, the air thick with the smell of decay. Broken benches and faded posters hung loosely from the walls. Graffiti covered most surfaces, scribbled warnings of danger and decay, but something about it felt different. Wrong. We wandered further into the station, and that's when things started to feel off. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light of our flashlights. We heard faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but they seemed to be coming from inside the building, as if they were the echoes of something long gone. I looked at my friends, and we all shared uneasy glances, not sure if we were imagining it or if something truly was there with us. Then, from down the corridor, we heard it. a faint metallic clinking, like something was dragging along the floor. We froze. The sound came again, closer this time, like it was coming toward us. I signaled to my friends to stay still, but before we could even speak, the light flickered above us. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the station, and the air felt charged, like we were standing in the center of some unexplainable tension. We moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. The clinking grew louder, echoing off the cracked walls. It wasn't coming from one of us. Something was there. A figure emerged from the shadows, barely visible but unmistakably human-like. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, and it appeared more as a shadow than a person. I stepped back, heart pounding. My friends had already begun to whisper frantically, but none of us could make sense of what we were seeing. The figure didn't seem fully alive. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over bones that looked too sharp, like they didn't belong. Its eyes were hollow, black as night, and it moved toward us without any sign of consciousness or intent. That's when we realized it wasn't human. Panic set in, but we didn't run. We couldn't. It was like the creature had already consumed the world around it, leaving only that suffocating silence. We turned to leave, but the door that had been open earlier was now shut. No breeze, no reason for it to have closed. The creature let out another growl, louder now, closer. We could hear its footsteps dragging along the floor as it approached. It didn't seem to care whether we ran or stayed. It didn't care if we lived or died. It wasn't moving with purpose, but with an unrelenting pull towards something. In that moment, it wasn't just fear that consumed me. It was confusion. What was this thing? What was it after? I don't know how much time passed before it stopped. The growling faded, and the dragging noise was gone. We didn't move. We didn't speak. The shadows grew darker, almost as if they were swallowing the faint glow of our flashlights. When we finally gathered the courage to look again, the station was empty. The door had opened. We walked out into the night, our breaths heavy, and we didn't look back. I've never gone back to that train station. I don't know what we encountered that night, and I don't think I want to. But every time I'm alone, there's always that thought. Whatever it was, it's still out there. It was a calm afternoon, the kind where the heat seems to bend the air. My friends and I decided to take a trip to the local beach, a place we'd visited many times before, but something felt different this time. The sun glared down from a cloudless sky as we pulled into the empty parking lot. The beach wasn't far, just a short walk from the car, but there were fewer people than usual. We set up our towels and chairs, laughing as we dove into the cool water. The waves were gentle, the kind you don't think twice about. For a while, it felt like nothing could go wrong. We swam, played around, and enjoyed the simplicity of the day. It wasn't until later, when the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the shore, that things began to feel off. We were sitting on the sand, watching the horizon, when one of my friends suddenly pointed toward the water. "There's something out there," she said, her voice quieter than before. At first, I didn't see anything, just the vast expanse of blue stretching out to meet the sky. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out a figure far in the distance. It wasn't a person, not a swimmer or a surfer. It looked almost like a shadow, dark and indistinct, moving slowly beneath the surface. The water didn't ripple in the way waves normally do. It was as if something was swimming just beneath, something large, something unnatural. "Is it a shark?" one of my friends asked, but none of us could answer. We all stood there staring at the spot where the figure had been, but now it was gone. The beach had become unnervingly quiet, save for the faint lapping of the waves. The sun had all but disappeared, replaced by a faint orange glow on the horizon. It was beautiful in an eerie way, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was off. "We should go," someone said. The idea of walking back to the car felt like a relief, but we couldn't shake the unease. The path back to the parking lot was dark and desolate, lined with dunes on one side and endless ocean on the other. The air felt thick, heavier than before, and we walked in silence. Halfway back, we stopped. There was a sound, something faint but unmistakable. A splash, not far from the shore. It echoed in the quiet evening air. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there, frozen, straining to hear anything else, but it was as if the world had gone still. No wind, no birds, just the faint sound of the waves. Then came the whispering. It started softly at first, almost like the wind, but we realized there wasn't any wind. It was a voice, or rather, many voices, whispers carried on the breeze. They were faint and incomprehensible, as if they were speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Panic gripped me. I could feel it in the way my heart pounded in my chest. We weren't alone. Something was out there, watching us, waiting. "We need to get back now," one of my friends said, her voice trembling. As we hurried to the car, the whispers grew louder, surrounding us. It was as though the entire beach was alive, breathing, and the sound of those whispers seemed to come from everywhere. I kept turning, scanning the dunes and the water, but saw nothing. Yet the voices remained, growing more insistent, more sinister. We finally made it to the car, fumbling with the keys, heartbeats thudding in our ears. The moment we slammed the doors shut, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Driving away, we didn't speak much. All I could think about was that figure beneath the water, the whispers that seemed to follow us, and how wrong the beach had felt. When I glanced back, the beach was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Whatever we saw that day, it's still out there, waiting. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when my friends and I decided to take a trip out to an old lake, tucked away from civilization. We were looking for something remote, peaceful, a way to escape the noise of daily life. The drive was long, and as we got further from the city, the landscape changed from paved roads to dusty trails and towering trees. The lake itself was beautiful, serene, surrounded by dense forest. We'd read about it online, something about its still, clear waters and the promise of tranquility. The plan was simple: hike around the lake, find a nice spot to set up camp, and spend the day swimming, fishing, and lounging by the shore. When we arrived, we were the only ones there. It felt like we had the entire lake to ourselves, the kind of solitude you only find when you're far away from everything. We unpacked our gear and set up camp, the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves the only things breaking the silence. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, we went to the shore to relax. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. We joked and laughed, tossing pebbles into the water, the sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. It was the kind of peace we'd all been craving. But that peace didn't last. It started with a noise, a distant, hollow thump. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was an animal or just the wind carrying strange sounds from deeper in the forest. But as the evening wore on, the thumping became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't fading away either. It seemed to be getting closer. I glanced at my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. None of us said anything at first, not wanting to ruin the atmosphere. But the thumps persisted, and now I could hear something else. Soft whispers, barely audible, carried on the breeze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. One of my friends, Sam, broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" We all nodded, uneasy. The sound was closer now. Too close. It wasn't just in the distance anymore. It was almost as if whatever was making those sounds was right there, just out of sight. We tried to convince ourselves it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some other forest creature. But whatever it wasn't leaving. The thumping was steady, relentless, and the whispers felt like they were growing louder. "Let's go check it out," Sam suggested, his voice trembling slightly. None of us were particularly eager, But curiosity outweighed our fear. We gathered our flashlights and followed the sound deeper into the woods. The trees became denser, the air cooler, and the silence seemed to press in on us. The whispers were unmistakable now, low and guttural, spoken in a language I couldn't recognize. It was almost like they were speaking directly into my head, as if they knew I could hear them. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The forest became eerily still again, and for a moment I thought we'd lost whatever had been making the noise. But then, just as I was about to speak, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not ours. These steps were slow, deliberate, and there were far too many of them. We stopped in our tracks, shining our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing. No one there. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder, as though they were circling us, closing in. Then, out of the corner of my flashlight beam, I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving through the trees. They weren't human, not exactly. More like distorted shapes, figures with no faces, no features, just black voids where they should have been. They didn't run. They glided through the forest with an unnatural, fluid grace. We couldn't speak. We couldn't move. The shadows drew closer, closing the space between us. I could feel their presence, their gaze upon us, even though there was nothing to see. It was as if they were pulling us in, whispering promises of silence and darkness. The forest seemed to breathe, the trees swaying gently as if they too were part of whatever was watching us. I felt as though I was being drawn towards something beyond comprehension. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the shadows vanished, leaving only silence. We stood there, frozen in place, the echoes of their whispers still ringing in my ears. It wasn't until we realized that the lake, once visible through the trees, was no longer in sight. We had wandered too far into the woods, far from where we had set up camp. Panic set in as we realized we were lost, but deep down, I knew whatever had followed us would never leave, at least not entirely.